Where is it? Okay, we live. Okay, I can hear stuff. If I could just get some posts in chat, just to confirm that I'm not complete boomering up the. Okay, yes. If I was more proficient at chatting, I'd have like a. If I was more proficient at this stuff, I would have had a fancy opening video and some music that you could all listen to. But I'm not. Now, can I get this to stream onto Telegram, or am I going to cut out obviously this boomer at the start as I try and figure out how to actually work a computer? Okay, now, how is everyone? So we wait for a couple people to meander in. Okay, I'm not a big fan of Restream, but this is what I'm going to try and use until I can figure out how to use. Okay, so that's using. Does this mean we won't see Spanish Civil War style volunteer battalions from Nicaragua and Mali being sent to Ukraine? I think we might. Maybe not Nicaragua, but yep, I hear you. Who knew it took so long to master the shill? I'm not too sure specifically what you're asking there. So, link, it's literally like a couple posts above. At least you're not getting your stream cooked by Telegram. I'm always getting cooked by something. If I can get back into the habit of trying to bang out regular streams, hopefully I'll get more proficient. I want to try and learn how to do OBS so I can stream onto Odyssey and yada, yada, yada. But I was saying that back in March, and look at where we are. So will we just go? How do I? Okay, don't think I need that. How do we get to seamless transitions? I'm just gonna have to play a Telegram thing, aren't I? Where's this speech? And we'll do an official start of the stream that isn't complete dog shit. Protesters to the front line. I'll briefly discuss that. Michael, thank you. You just said my name. Probability of tactical nukes being deployed. I'll get to that. NFKRS drafted general opinion on the war. I was teasing about your. Just wait for a couple more people to sort of meander in, and hopefully start if I can actually figure out. See, no, I don't know. Could someone tell me if the audio of this goes straight through into? Oh damn it! That's going to show up all my Telegram stuff, isn't it? Nope, not going to do that. And Telegram just crashed. For fuck's sake. Thoughts on what Kadyrov said. There's been so much going on. I've missed what Kadyrov has said. If you could refresh me. And I'll have a quick look before I really start to pile into this. Okay, I was going to play the thing of Putin, but I don't think the audio will transition from. In fact, yeah, we'll do a quick test. I don't think it will, but chat, I'm going to bring up Putin's speech. If you could just tell me if the audio passes through into the audio for the stream. Or not. I prefer not to.
Country and to the people of different generations, age groups, and ethnicities, to the people of our great motherland, to everyone who's united by the great historic Russia, to the soldiers and officers, volunteers who are now fighting.
Could I just get a bit of confirmation that Vladimir Vladimirovich's audio is passing through to you guys, or is it just the audio from me?
Citizens of the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions and other areas that have been liberated from the neo-Nazi regime. I'm going to talk about the unnecessary.
I hear it. Does anyone else hear it? Like, is it coming through okay that you can hear it, or audio is fine? Yes, it's awesome, awesome, awesome. I wish I knew this. Okay. Right. With that aside, the official start to the stream, so I know where I'm going to clip this out, is we will play a... Yeah, okay. So 1, 2, 3, stream starts now. With that, your audio is capturing the song audio, bro. That's the hope, but I guess it probably wasn't the best. Very quiet compared to when you speak. Okay, so it wasn't streaming the point. It was just picking up what's coming out of the. Okay, sorry for that. That nothing ever works the way I want it. So let's go to our happy man. Well, he's not as happy as people would expect. There's been a lot has happened. I'm sure if you're in my channel, if you've been following exciting events in Ukraine and Russia, we're probably all going to die horrifically, being turned to ash or glass in the next 6 months, because events are drastically escalated significantly over the past, I guess, 2 weeks, but specifically we're going to be addressing the things that have occurred within the last 4 days at most. Yesterday, day before, that's the kind of timeline. So how should I structure this? Just to give a quick outline of why we are here. I'm sure most of you will be aware of this, but just for people who don't autistically follow this stuff as the rest of us do, the war has largely been bogged down for most of the summer. The Russian advance slowed to a very slow crawl for various reasons I'll not go into, because that's out the breadth of this stream and I've covered it before. But in September, the past 2-3 weeks, the war has sped up significantly, most of all down to Ukrainian counteroffensives. There is an ongoing counteroffensive in Kherson that's still very much in contention, but most of all, there was the lightning Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv, which led to effectively the complete collapse of the northern Russian front. I'm not going to go into the specific details fully of that. There is another video which I will try to remember to link whenever I put this out as a standalone video of what happened specifically in the Kharkiv front. But as a result of that, there has been a massive escalation. So first of all, I would like to speak about our happy Strelkov man, Igor Gurkin, who many are saying has predicted this for a long time coming. I don't think it's really a premonition he has had. I'm not going to say like I'm an expert or something, but people who have not been complete, like, feed me Russian propaganda, give me it hard, daddy kind of, Russian MOD, just bang out that hot latest propaganda take right into my mouth. People who have had a bit more sense than that could probably have guessed that the Russian military hasn't been performing up to par. There's about 2 or 3 big reasons, I think, why, but the biggest reason has been there has just been a chronic lack of manpower for various political reasons that Moscow has adhered to. But the Russians just haven't had the men, the physical men, to achieve what they are looking to achieve in Ukraine, in the special military operation, etc., etc. This, again, I think I've covered that in another stream, or I might cover it in a stream to come. But essentially, kind of pushed things to the fore for the Russians, because the Russians were kind of trying to conduct this war with half measures. They're trying to conduct a quote-unquote special military operation, whereas they're actually de facto trying to fight a war. So that came to the fore in events in Kharkiv, where I'm sure the incompetence of the local commanders, the failure of Russian intelligence to pick up the buildup of Ukrainian forces, especially considering that Russian telegram accounts were picking it up. But the reason why the front seemed to have collapsed in the humiliating fiasco way that it did, and significant amounts of equipment have been abandoned and now captured by the Ukrainians, seems to be that there just wasn't enough men to properly staff the front, especially in terms of Russian regular army soldiers. These are standing kontraktniki troops. There seemed to have been a very small amount of those. Again, a lot of them were deployed for Kherson, but I've addressed that in another stream. But in terms of the people actually on the front line, as in the people in the trenches who are expected to face Ukrainian tanks, although there is allegedly only 15 of them that partook in this offensive. But essentially, combat troops, the Russians were deploying militia from Lugansk. These were second-rate militia from what I've been able to ascertain. Not exactly the people you want to be holding an area during an offensive. And also Russian Rosguardia and Sobor troops. These are gendarmes. These are paramilitary police, is kind of the best way to describe them. These are not combat troops. These are not people who are meant to be put into the thick of combat and expected to hold the front line. The Rosguardia and Sobor, to their credit, seem to have held out for 3 days, but essentially the Lugansk and the Russian army fled the field of combat, and that led to the complete collapse of the Kharkiv front. Very humiliating for Moscow. Russian media was forced to talk about it, and they were quite critical of it. Russian telegram accounts, which I think is where most Russians who actually follow this stuff, i.e. the domestic population in Russia, who are really interested in what's happening in Ukraine, I think most of them get their information from telegram as opposed to the Russian media. Those who are a bit more switched on, there's big recriminations from them towards the Russian MOD, the Russian state, and essentially it looked bad. It looked really bad, legitimately. And I think it could be said that if the Russians didn't take their recent escalations, as the Russians could be said that they're effectively on the road to effectively losing the war. So with that in mind, Russia has escalated the war significantly, very significantly. So I'm sure, as most people are aware, I will bring up the actual post. It is although I'd prefer to be able to do it without having to dock my Telegram. But where is the rundown of... Where is it? I had it somewhere, but I can't seem to find it. I'm going to go over what essentially Putin has outlined. So, in fact, instead of putting up on Telegram, so I don't dox everyone in my Telegram. So this is a quick rundown of the things. So Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation, gave an address. Not yesterday, the day before now. My sleeping pattern's a bit screwed, so it's a bit hard to keep tabs of what's happening and when. But essentially, he's announced a couple of major things. First of all, the Donbass republics and the civil military administrations in Zaporozhye and Kherson. These are the Russian occupied / liberated, depending on what worldview you ascribe to, territories of southern Ukraine, have announced that they are going to be holding referenda that start tomorrow, I believe, on the 23rd, and will extend to the 27th. These are referenda for accession, annexation to the Russian Federation as federal subjects of the Russian Federation. So, in effect, that these are, once these territories vote, and I don't really think there's any credible reason to think that they're going to vote as anything other than accession to the Russian Federation, they're going to do a Crimea scenario, but obviously complicated by the fact that these are on front lines of a war. So whether they exceed as republics or oblasts or okrogs or whatever, these will de jure, by law, legally, in terms of Russian domestic opinion, international, no, not domestic opinion, in terms of domestic Russian law. International law doesn't really apply to this so much for the implications of it, but in terms of Russian law, and as far as the legal situation that the Russian government can look at this, is the Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk will become Russian territory, as integral to Russia as Belgorod, is not Moscow because it's a special place, but Kursk, Bryansk, Rostov Oblast, they will become integrated parties of the Russian Federation once these referenda finish within the next 5 days, 5, 6, 7 days. The implications of this are quite massive, but it appears that this is all largely being coordinated, because of course it would be. Those were announced. Then Putin came forward to give his special address to the Russian Federation. The only second one that he has really done since the war began, his first one being his announcement of the special military operation back in February 23rd, I believe, going into the 24th. And his announcement the other day was, well, I'm not saying it verbatim, but essentially there was a number of key points to take away from it. So the decree on partial mobilization in Russia, in accordance with federal laws, yada, 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 to announce partial mobilization from the Russian Federation from September 21st, i.e. yesterday, to carry out the call of citizens of the Russian Federation for military service for mobilization of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Citizens of the Russian Federation called up for military service by mobilization have the status of military personnel serving in the armed forces of the Russian Federation under contract. Established a level of pay for citizens of the Russian Federation called up for military service by mobilization into the armed forces of the Russian Federation corresponds to the level of pay for military personnel in the Russian Federation of the armed forces of the Russian Federation under contract. God. Contracts for the passage of military service concluded by military personnel continue to be valid until the end of the period of partial mobilization, with exception of cases of dismissal of military personnel. Do I really need to read all this? Let's have a look. in connection with entry into the force to the government to finance activity, take the necessary measures to meet the needs of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, other troops, military formations, bodies during the period of partial militarization. Highest official of constituent entities, i.e. the federal subjects of the Russian Federation, shall ensure the conscription of citizens for military service for mobilization in the armed forces of the Russian Federation in, instead of Russian Federation, I'm just going to say Russia from now, in the number within the time limits determined by the Ministry of Defense of Russia for each constituent entity of Russia. Provide citizens of the Russian Federation working in organizations of the military-industrial complex with the right of deferment from conscription or military service for mobilization for the yada yada yada. The categories of the citizens of Russia. Decree comes into force from the day of its official publication. So that was a bit wordy, but essentially what that was, this is just a quick rundown, although a very, very wordy one, of what Putin announced. Namely, the biggest thing is that Putin has, quote unquote, partially mobilized citizens of Russia to go into the categories of what that actually means and what we can expect to see. So going by what Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has announced, they are looking for 300,000 Russian men, potentially some women as well, but it will be mostly Russian men because that's how it works in Russia, who will be mobilized and effectively sent off to the front. So these people, they have already begun to get them. They're getting military call-up cards. They are to report for military service. They will go to their military units. They will, from what I've seen, and I don't see why it shouldn't be expected, is that they will then undergo a period of retraining. These are to specify exactly who this is meant to have applied to from what the Russian government has released, but there's some caveats to this, is that these are Russian men, mostly Russian men, who have gone through conscription. These are young Russian men who have, within the past 5 years, I believe it is, have completed their military contract. These are former contract soldiers who are on the reserve books. Or these are going to be people who have gone through either or, potentially not. Maybe they'll have served in the Rosguardia, the Sobor, the Omnon, maybe some other kind of government service. But they might have various skills the Russian MOD that Russia might feel will be of use to operations in Ukraine. So that's the sort of categories of men that we're talking about. And then they will go off. Some of them might be rushed straight to the front. We'll have to wait and see. This is the second day of this. And I'll go into various bits of footage that show what's happening. But what is expected is these people will probably go off for at least a few weeks, maybe a couple months of retraining. They'll go back to their military bases. They will go out into their fields. They'll be trained up because they're going to need a lot more than conscription training for what they're going to be going into. Because conscription, the training you get whenever you're conscripted in Russia, it is very hit and miss. Often it's very poor if you get trained at all. You could just effectively be used as, I don't want to say slave labor, but corvée labor for your regimental commander. That is obviously not exactly getting trained with weaponry. So, and also because of the nature of the combat in Ukraine, I think some Russian commanders at least will have cottoned on that the nature of the combat in Ukraine is going to require a certain level of retraining, of prepping these guys to understand what exactly they're going to go into, and their training will be tailored towards that. So that's the process that we will see. We will expect to see we'll have to see over the next couple of days. So, and also the economic measures, as they quickly mentioned there. What that to me says is that, to sort of paraphrase it, the way the Russians have been fighting this war is you have to sort of make an analogy to the way I've sort of looked at it is the way the United States, Western nations fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. So how do I quantify that? The Russian government wanted to fight a war, but they wanted to fight it with less impact on the domestic population at all. There's been... So essentially, if you weren't involved in the military, if you weren't directly impacted by someone who went to the front, if your specific industry wasn't involved in arms manufacture, obviously you'll have been hit by the sanctions, but generally the war is something that's far away. You could largely have ignored it to a degree. It happens far away over there. Kind of like how the United States fought in Iraq. Essentially, if you weren't in the military, you could have lived throughout the 2000s and not really have been impacted by any large degree by the war in Iraq. So what is now happening is, the analogy I'm going to put forward is that Russia is now moving to sort of like how the United States dealt with Vietnam. Is there is now going to be a draft, not quite analogous to the actual draft that happened in the United States, but there's going to be a draft. The economy is now going to start to be mobilized. War essential industries, they're going to produce potentially tanks, refurbish vehicles coming out of storage, producing new armaments for the war effort. They are going to take priority. Civilian economics is going to be, if it is relevant to it, civilian economies, industries, and businesses are going to be directed towards fulfilling those needs. We're not talking mobilization of World War II era. This is not the Soviet Union. It's not total war where every woman goes into the factory and every man goes into the army. It's far from that, but it is a step in that direction. It has gone from I don't want to say a full civilian economy, because it was an economy trying to deal with sanctions, but it is moving away from that complete sort of peacetime economic focus to a now recognition that we are having to step up the game to meet the challenge. So the Russians have kind of recognized that the way they were conducting the war is they were not looking to win it to any substantial degree. So this is now a step to rectify that. I have done many posts in the Telegram channel, some streams here and there, outlining the problems that the Russians were facing. And this is now the Russians seemingly standing up, or at least Moscow standing up to try and rectify that. So that's the terms with conscription. However, it should be said that the actual wording around the decree is very vague. There's some suggestions that potentially 1 million men fall under the category that could be called up if needs to, but the figure quoted by the MOD and Shogu is 300,000 men. So we'll have to wait and see as things go on to see how that manifests itself. On top of this, another thing that is open to question is, throughout the summer, and what was an ongoing process and potentially still is an ongoing process, is the Russians were looking to recruit anyone and anyone into quote unquote volunteer units. The actual nature of these units is open to conjecture. I've yet to see anything that definitively pins down exactly what these were. But Russian federal subjects, the example I usually use is like Buratio or Tuva. The local administration in these oblasts, republics, or krogs, these Russian federal subjects, would announce that by their own initiative that they are going to that they are going to form their own independent units. You have to the way I look at these is like the Kadyrovites, the Chechen forces that Kadyrov has mustered and sent to Ukraine. These answer, well, they're not quite analogous to the Chechen units because they answer to Kadyrov. They don't answer to the Russian MOD, but essentially it's that kind of mentality. Is a local federal subject will start to mobilize, start to arm up its own volunteer unit that will then almost certainly be seconded to the Russian MOD, but they are not soldiers. They are not part of the Russian army. They're not part of the Russian military. These seem to be quite desperate units from what I could see. The anecdotal evidence that I've seen is pictures and videos of these people are not the kind of people you really want to send into combat. They're either effectively teenagers, or some of the men looked genuinely like they were 60-year-old alcoholics from like the backwoods of Tuva. And there was reports that these guys were getting somewhere like as little as 2 weeks refresher training, and then they would potentially be sent off to Ukraine. The nature of those units, we'll have to keep a lookout on, see if they've just effectively been abolished or if they'll just be merged into this new mobilized force. So that is something we'll have to keep an eye on. Why I'm mentioning that is because that, alongside the Wagner group, was recruiting men from prisons. Sort of outlines to me that the Russians were very desperate for manpower. That was very apparent. That was one of my biggest criticisms for how the Russians were conducting this. The mobilization is obviously to remedy that. Now, to add into this, I could probably structure how I'm addressing this a bit better. Forgive me, but my streams are always kind of impromptu in fly of the cuff. But on top of this, we now need to go back to the referenda, because these referenda have very, as I kind of hinted to, they have very strong legal implications for these men and for the wider war. So once these referenda pass, and like I say, it's almost certain that they will vote yes, quote unquote, to accession to the Russian Federation. Now that these territories that are formally recognized as, well, by Russian law, because that's really all matters here, is foreign territories under the administration of the Russian Federation, or as the independent republics of the Donbass, once they transition from that status into then being legal territories of the Russian Federation, that opens more significant legal doors, which Putin did address in his speech, for how Moscow can progress with the war. So at the moment, as it stands legally, the Russians have these manpower shortages for various reasons. This will address those. Well, almost certainly will address those in spades. But Russian kontraktniki, contract troops, these are the professional Russian army. These are the vast majority of the Russian forces and aligned forces in fighting in Ukraine. There is an interesting legal quirk where they can actually refuse deployment to combat zones outside of Russia. So, for example, say a year ago, there was a Russian soldier who was told he was getting deployed to Syria. He could legally refuse that deployment. As the war in Ukraine, what the hell was that? I'm sorry, something just popped. I don't know, unless I've been shot. As the war in Ukraine really bogged down and the fighting became very bitter and very costly, there were increasing numbers of Russian contract soldiers who were refusing deployment and service to Ukraine. That was further weakening and clearing out the Russian manpower base. That didn't come without a cost. There's various costs to that. Just to kind of touch on it, in Russia, basically the biggest thing a young Russian man, I need to stop saying basically, but the biggest CV the biggest thing that a young Russian man can have that counts as a CV is his military record papers. This goes over how he did in conscription, how he did if he did during his contract service. This is what they take to their employer. Their employer sees it, and then if it's a good report, then that says, okay, this is someone I might employ. Contract soldiers who refuse this deployment, their Russian commanders in various units have kind of done some really interesting and exotic ways to screw up these men's future career paths by giving some very interesting reviews. and CV references, as it were. Just anecdotally, I've seen examples, purported examples of contract soldiers having in their military service papers, their commanders written, for example, he was usually drunk and was often engaged in homosexual orgies. That is something I did see. That was, well, I can't read Cyrillic, but that was the quotation that I seen. That is one of the extreme examples. More tame examples that I've seen is Russian commanders who've written off references on contract soldiers who have refused service, saying, like, for example, they were work shy, exhibited cowardice, were unreliable in any task they were given. So that's kind of how the Russians tried to deal with that. It didn't really work because increasingly more of these contract soldiers were refusing service. And it should be said, I don't think they were refusing service because they were cowards. These are professional soldiers. They have signed up voluntarily to serve in the army. Did they know they were going to war? Maybe not, but nonetheless, they are volunteer soldiers. And certain examples I've seen is that a lot of these men who did refuse service, they believe in the military. They believe in the military, the special military operation in Ukraine. They believe that Ukraine is like a Nazi state that's about to genocide half of Russia. These are ideologically committed men. They were refusing service because they felt that they were being sent into just completely untenable combat situations by incompetent commanders, poorly equipped, not properly supported. They felt they believed in the war, but they were not going to fight a war where they were pretty much guaranteed certain death or severe injury, because they felt that they were being, essentially that the war is being conducted in such a manner that although they might believe that it is just, that they felt that the way it was conducted was just totally inappropriate to potentially risk their lives on. That is, from my understanding from the examples that I've seen, that is the largest body of the contract Niki who refused service, and the reason that they refused their service in Ukraine. So now, I know that was a bit of a spiel, but getting back to, I should probably bring up a map because I'm sure one can only look at the visage. That is Strelkov. Happy Strelkov in his party hat. Don't worry, we will discuss Strelkov. He's not as happy as this picture might make him out to be. So, as always, a trusty map. This is not the most reliable map. It does tend to be more pro-Ukrainian, but I'm just using it just to outline various territories. So the red area is, I'm sure as most people who are watching this and are autistically invested in this as me will know, this is what the Russians currently hold. These areas are what is going to be subject to the upcoming referenda. So now, why is the referenda so important? Okay. Right. Once these territories pass the referenda and the Russian Duma accepts the results, it integrates them into the Russian Federation. Why was I going on so long about the contract Niki? Once this territory now becomes Russian land, the territory of the Russian Federation, contract Niki could not refuse service here, because this no longer becomes a foreign deployment. This becomes a domestic deployment, and contract Niki and conscripts as well could not refuse service within the boundaries of the Russian Federation without a declaration of war. So the declaration of war is something I'll come to in a bit. But so, for example, Kharkiv is pretty much gone. There's some interesting legal quirks we'll have to keep an eye on for this territory of Kharkiv, but essentially the biggest things at the moment are Kherson, to a degree Zaporozhye, and Donetsk. Once Donetsk we'll use Donetsk as our example. Once Donetsk accedes to the Russian Federation, I can pretty much be guaranteed that the Russians will consider all of Donetsk Oblast in terms of Ukraine and internationally recognized borders of Donetsk Oblast will then be considered for legal means by Russia, by the Duma, by the Russian military as Russian territory. So it will not just be this territory that is currently administered by the Donetsk People's Republic. This part of Donetsk that is still held by Ukraine, the Russians will now legally consider that part of the Russian Federation. So that means that kontraktniki who are deployed to this area will be obligated to carry out military activity and military deployment in this area in offensive operations. I guess legally the Russians could say it's defensive, but effectively it will be offensive operations to take the rest of Donetsk Oblast. Also, add on to that, conscripts could not be deployed outside of the Russian Federation without a formal declaration of war. As I've just mentioned, once this area now becomes part of the Russian Federation, the conscripts can be called up. Conscripts are not usually the best of troops. The ones that were deployed in the opening invasion kind of demonstrated that. But the point is you don't need really the best of troops to just fill up the line. And that is what the Russians need. Most of all is men just to fill up the line. So we're going to see 2 Russian armies, potentially 3 Russian armies kind of develop out of this. So what we are going to see, because Putin's forgive me, I need to take a drink. So the only real announcement that the Russian government and MOD has announced is the mobilization of potentially 300,000 men. What they have not mentioned is the deployment of potential conscripts, which I think they will do. Because that is, once these areas accede to Russia, that becomes a legal possibility. And the way I can see this working out is, just to give you a sort of outline of how the Russians have conducted the war for the past number of months, is the frontline positions, especially on the northern end of the front, is largely like the people actually on the front line on defensive works in the trenches have largely been the Donetsk militias and Rosguardia. Sometimes the Chechens as well, but the Chechens tend to be a bit more down in Zaporozhye, from my understanding. These are the guys who are in the trench, looking out over no man's land at the potential Ukrainians. Behind them are the battalion tactical groups, and they're all Russian military. They're contract soldiers. The battalion tactical groups are the guys who seem to be the ones who, whenever that did happen, try to implement these incremental advances. They're the offensive troops, and that's what they're meant to be. But for various reasons, which I've outlined in previous streams and in the channel, the battalion tactical groups were largely stripped away from Kharkiv and the Donbass into the Kherson and Zaporozhye area. So what we've seen is these, what are meant to be mobile offensive units, have now largely become the frontline defensive infantry, filling up the trenches, which is not what they're meant to do. A tank can be a good defensive barrier, but that's not what the tank is meant to be there. Especially, that's why we've seen so much Ukrainian drone footage of Russian tanks, BTRs, BMPs being taken out by drones dropping grenades, because they've been stuck in static positions on this front line. Now, once the conscripts potentially come in, we'll have to wait and see if this is happening. When the conscripts potentially come in, I expect that what we'll see is those battalion tactical groups, where they have been used as that, will be pulled away from the front line into the rear area. And instead, the frontline troops will probably be taken up by these conscripts. They'll be used as to hold the line, to use the manpower to fill up the line. Potentially, we could be seeing some of the mobilized forces that do that. But what I expect the mobilized forces will largely do is to fill up the manpower of the battalion tactical groups, of the standing Russian divisions behind the lines, the artillery units, stuff like that. Because I've seen some estimates where certain Russian battalion tactical groups were only operating at potentially 20% of their manpower complement from the start of the invasion all the way up to today. These were very, very chronically undermanned units. Then that's what I expect the mobilized troops will be going into, because again, pointing out, these mobilized troops are people who have previous military service or are meant to have. They have skills that will be in demand. These are valuable men. Conscripts, by their nature, are not really valuable men. They're a mass force. They're the guys you put in the front line to weather any potential attack. So to sort of put it into it, the mobilized and the contract Niki, they're valuable. The conscripts aren't really valuable. It's a bit grim to say, but that's kind of the assessment that I expect the Russians and any sort of sensible, some person with any kind of sort of military understanding would take it. So if the conscripts aren't valuable, you give them the not very valuable jobs. Well, it is a valuable job, but you can afford to lose them to a large degree. So the front line will be staffed by conscripts. Where if the Ukrainians do launch an attack, if the conscripts don't completely just immediately collapse, they will report up Ukrainian attack in this position. The more valuable battalion tactical groups staffed by the contract Niki and now the mobilized forces, they will now move. They could then be used to move in and quash any Ukrainian attack. They could be used to move in on offensive operations, stuff like that. So we'll have to, this is an assumption that I'm making. There's a lot of assumptions at the moment. We'll have to wait and see how things pan out. But that's the assumption that I'm kind of operating off, is that the conscripts will be used as the mass frontline unit. The battalion tactical groups will now be relegated to what they should have always been, but manpower constraints force them to be used in other fashions. But the battalion tactical groups will now be used as sort of like the offensive thrust, specialized units to counter Ukrainian offensives, but also potentially in the future to hypothetically go on offensive operations themselves. And then, of course, you'll have all the artillery units, which seem to be what most of the Russian military in the Donbass and the war have largely been. They stay behind the line and provide artillery to where it's needed, when and as in theater. So that's kind of how I'm potentially viewing this to come out. We'll have to wait and see in the days to come. So referenda passes, conscripts, contract troops can now be deployed in mass to these territories. On top of this, Putin has hinted that he's talked up the nuclear angle again. I think it's, again, this is assumption because I'm not in Moscow. I'm not part of the inner circle, but what I think that is kind of a shot across the bow, but also kind of a political mechanism of Putin in regards to this. So he's floated the idea that there might be the utilization of nuclear weaponry in defense of sovereign Russian territory and the integrity of the Russian state. Russian nuclear doctrine does allow for that, but does that mean Putin is going to start dropping tactical nuclear weapons on Ukrainian forces in Zaporozhye, Kherson? I very much doubt that. What I think this is goes into the wider aspect of what's happened the past couple of days. So I think Russia has been fighting this war kind of with half measures for a while. And this is kind of him firing the shot across the bow of Ukraine. And the West sitting there saying, we are now stepping up. This is now serious. We are going to be taking this forward. We are dedicated to this fight, and we will progress this fight to win it. Because before it seemed to be that the Russians were taking a kind of half-hearted approach to this. This is now we are stepping up to the challenge. And I think the nuclear threat was part of that. It might be a sort of, the term is escalate to de-escalate in terms of the nuclear thing. Putin could have dropped the nuclear. He's used it for a number of times as he's hinted that the utilization of nuclear weapons could be on the table. I don't think it realistically is, because I don't think the man wants to destroy the planet. But opening that door makes people stand up and take notice. We'll have to wait and see how the West responds to this, but obviously the West is going to respond to this escalation of Russia in terms of manpower with new equipment to Ukraine and new support to Ukraine. However, that nuclear threat could be seen as sort of to dissuade that to a degree. That's, so whereas the West might instead say, okay, we're going to deploy ATACMS long-range long-range missiles to Ukraine. That's something the Russians have always drawn a line at. That's the West could be tempted, the United States could be tempted to cross that line now, considering the Russians have just mobilized. The nuclear threat, considering that Putin specifically talked about long-range missiles, could sort of tell Washington, okay, maybe we should walk back on that a bit. But also maybe the threat of a nuclear escalation. There could be back-channel talks where NATO officials, American officials could reach out to the Russians over this nuclear issue and say, okay, you're threatening nuclear weapons. There is a war going on, but we don't want it to become a nuclear war. Maybe we can have some kind of back-channel discussions and talk down this threat. And then the Russians are using that as a way to, one, have dialogue with Western powers, but also as a way to use that dialogue to potentially look at concessions, try and form out negotiation tactics and wiggle room there. Because alongside this, of course, I don't know, the timing kind of tells me it was probably a bit too coincidental for it to have been a complete coincidence. But obviously, for people who are not aware, there was a large prisoner exchange, high-profile prisoner exchange that the Russians and Ukraine engaged in, where I believe Medvedchuk actually was passed over, but the Russians passed over around about 200 Ukrainian prisoners of war. These are Azov guys, but also foreign fighters. They were transported to Turkey. I believe the Ukrainians have to stay in Turkey until the end of the war. That seems to be the story there, because the foreign nationals who were sent to Saudi Arabia have now since gone back to their country of origin. So the exact details of that deal we'll have to look out for. But obviously that seems to be sort of a goodwill, ironically, considering how many times the Russians have used that term. It does seem to be a goodwill gesture from the Russians to Ukraine, but mostly to the Western powers, to say, we've escalated. We are upping the ante in this war, but we are also potentially open to some kind of back channel discussions in the way. So, what will I discuss now on top of that? So, mobilization, nuclear triad, Forgive me, let me take a quick drink. So that's kind of the big story at the moment. Mobilization, economic, gearing up, the prisoner transfer. I will come on to Gherkin in a second. Yes, that is what I want to talk about. So now, the speed of this is something that we will have to pay attention to. An assumption I made is, I'll go into a bit of autistic history here. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had one of the world's best mobilization systems. What am I talking about here? So whenever you mobilize, what does that mean? Whenever you call up 300,000 men, what does that look like on the ground? How does that function? How does that manifest? Well, to go by the Soviet example, because this is what the Russian and Ukrainian examples are used off, is just thinking this might expand out into a really long tangent, so I'll try and keep it brief. Generally, most countries do not keep their military units fully staffed in peacetime. So, for example, like the example I'm personally aware of is in the British Army. Say, for example, you'll have, let's take, for example, the Welsh Guards. You have the Welsh Guards. You'll have around about 2 or 3 battalions of that will be the professional Welsh Guards. These are people who have signed on as volunteer soldiers. These are the people who are stood up in peacetime. They are always in their unit. They're always training in that unit. Alongside that, you might have another 2 battalions of territorials. The territorials, I think, they changed the name. It's not the territorials anymore. It's the think it's the reserves. Yeah. You have the reserve forces. Historically, it was the territorials. These are your quote unquote weekend soldiers. These are the guys who have a regular job. They go out, work a civilian job, but I should know this because I did this. Once a month, potentially around about once a month, is they will go off on a training camp. They will go put on their uniform. They will go off and train with their unit and just keep their skills updated. They might have whenever I did it, but I did it for the UOTC. Potentially, like they might have to meet up for a couple hours every Wednesday at their territorial base and take lectures, train, just keep themselves up to date. Whenever we were still engaged in Afghanistan, what you would see is, say, the Welsh Guards were being deployed on the deployment to Afghanistan to make up you'll have the couple of battalions of professional guys will go out, but they might need more troops. So then the regiment will put out the call to the territorials, the reservists, and say, okay, we need more men. Do you want to come out and do a 6-month tour with us in Afghanistan? And then if there's any reservists want to do that, they can then sign up to it, and they get I believe their civilian job cannot fire them. It's capped for them, and effectively they go out and fight in the war for 6 months, then they come back and go back to their civilian job, but they still do this monthly camp, weekly meetup kind of thing. That's, in the United States, that's kind of what the National Guard is. You'll have your standing US Army divisions, and then you'll have your National Guard who will be deployed when and as they might be needed. In Russia, this will then go back into why I'm bringing in the Soviet example of this. During peacetime, the Russian army tends to be quite officer heavy. That means generally you have a lot more enlisted men. These are your NCOs, these are your privates, opposed to your officers. That's kind of how an army is meant to be. Is you shouldn't have more officers than you have enlisted men, or you should have potentially 10 enlisted personnel to an officer. The proportions change on the unit, the scenario, and the country. So the Russian army is usually being quite heavy on its officers and senior NCOs, who tend to be contract Niki during peacetime. Why is that? That comes from the Soviet legacy. That's because during peacetime, it's very expensive to keep a couple thousand men day in, day out in their unit in full military contract. So that's how the Russian army works. You've got the conscript force, then you've got the reservists, and then you've got the professional contract Niki. So during peacetime, and seems to be how the Russians went into the invasion for some reason, is a Russian military unit could only have around about 20% to 40% to 60% in the higher cases of its military complement, of its manpower that it's supposed to have. So whenever the invasion began, whenever the Russians conducted their invasion, you had very chronically understrength units went into Ukraine to fight. And the results kind of speak for themselves. If anyone remembers my early streams back in March, whenever I was just constantly like, why are Russian tanks driving into towns with no infantry support? It's because there was no infantry. It's because they just had their bare skeleton vehicle crews, and their BTRs of BMPs might have only actually had 2 infantry in them, whenever they should have 6 or potentially 8 soldiers in them. And since then, that's kind of how the Russians have been conducting the war, with these very understrength units. They've tried to use the Donetsk militias, the Rosguardia, the Chechens to make up the difference in the manpower shortage. So now going back to the Soviet examples to sort of go into mobilization and how I'll go into this next tangent. Throughout the Cold War, this is kind of the same for the USSR. The Soviet units on the front, actually, in what used to be East Germany, tended to be fully staffed. These were your Soviet soldiers who came in, signed up for a military career. These were the guys who went to staff the units in East Germany, in Czechoslovakia, places like this. This is where you put your fully staffed professional forces or your nearly staffed professional forces. The rest of the Soviet army that might be based in all across the Western Soviet Union and where else, potentially some places in Eastern Europe, they could have potentially only had around about 20 to 40% of their manpower allocation. More, obviously, that would make up a lot of that would have been the senior NCOs, but your officers. This is what we mean whenever it's like you're officer heavy, you're senior NCO heavy, because you're not going to send in a squad of sergeants or a squad of lieutenants as an infantry unit during the war. So why is that? Why is there so many officers, so many NCOs, and so little men in these battalions? Well, this is where the Soviet mobilization came in. Obviously, the USSR spent around about 40 years expecting to fight an apocalyptic war against NATO in Germany. But because of the nature of the economy in the USSR, and also the way the USSR just generally was, every adult male did military service in some form or another. Obviously, there was medical exemptions and potentially some educational exemptions, but as it still is in Russia, unless there's an exemption, every adult male and quite a lot of women as well did military service. They went off to conscription. A lot of them went into things like military fire, essentially fire brigades, but they were military fire brigades. If anyone has any idea of Chernobyl, the firefighters who turned up at Chernobyl were largely these kind of conscripts who were conscripted into military service, but they were sent to a fire unit. They could have been conscripted as border troops, as to deal with forest fires in Siberia. That's kind of how it took, but they all did military service and they all had military training. They were all trained to use an AK pattern rifle, to use RPGs, and if they were specialized in some degree, they were trained as drivers to operate B8 BTRs, that kind of thing. So over time, that builds up a large manpower, which is kind of what we're seeing with the Russians. You know, whenever people are saying, how do the Russians have 300,000 to 1 million men that they can just pull out of the hat? That's these people who should have, and most of them will have gone through conscription service, but there'll be some nuances if they were properly trained or not for various reasons. But going by the Soviet example, over decades, you build up quite a large body of people who have a military training, who are on the books to be mobilized. And the USSR, from my understanding, regularly engaged in exercises to test their mobilization system. So the statistics vary, but from my understanding is, say we're in 1986, Able Archer happens and someone decides that they're going to go through the Fulda Gap and Germany erupts into the battlefield of the Third World War. Well, on the very front line, you have your almost, if not fully staffed, Soviet army divisions with your Warsaw Pact divisions. They begin the fight, provided the world doesn't end immediately. Well, what about all the rest of the Soviet army that only has 20% complement of men? Well, the estimates that I've seen is that the Soviet Union could mobilize an entire division. A Soviet division, if I'm not mistaken, was around about 12,000 men. Let me just have a quick look just to confirm that. Or am I thinking of a regiment? Around about 9,000 to 12,000 men. Okay, so yeah, a Soviet division could go from round about having potentially 1,000 to 2,000 of its manpower complement, and it could be fully staffed up to 10,000 to 12,000 men in the space of 4 to 5 days, and it could be in East Germany in that time. So that's the speed at which the Soviet Union appears to have been able to achieve this. So if you think about the sheer logistics of that, it kind of tells you how much the Soviets worked this down to a key. Is that a Soviet battalion division that's stationed in Moscow? Well, technically it could be stationed in Poland or in East Germany, but it could have 8,000 of its troops called up from Moscow or across the USSR and transported thousands of miles into East Germany, put into uniform and put into the front in the space of around about 4 to 5 days. That's very fast. The only other country that approaches that kind of level is Israel. Without going too much into, I know some people really want to talk about Israel, but oh, I didn't know Google recognizes the Golan Heights as part of Israel now. Okay, well, we're just talking academically about the IDF here. You think about things like the Yom Kippur War, the rapid mobilization of the IDF, putting hundreds, tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of young Israeli men back into uniform, into the front line in the space of a week, a couple of days. That's the kind of mobilization speeds we're talking about here. So with that idea, that's how the Soviet Union did it. That's what the Soviet Union could achieve. The Soviet Union collapses. The need to potentially put a couple million men into arms in the space of a week doesn't really seem apparent anymore. There's not the money to maintain the systems. There's not the money to maintain a military of that size. Again, this is an assumption I made on my part. We'll have to wait and see how this happens. But my assumption was that this finely tuned Soviet era mobilization system largely decayed and just evaporated over the past 30 years. So we will have to wait and see how this comes out, if the Russians can achieve anything like that, which I don't expect they would, at least not to a mass degree, but I'll show some evidence potentially contradicting that. So the reason why because it was baffling to me why the Russians didn't mobilize at all. They just seemed to have a block on it. And the assumption I had is that the Russians did not have a decent enough ability to mobilize their troops, that they were always hesitant to do it, that if they tried to do it, it would just be an embarrassment. Obviously, we are now going to see that put to the test. Just flip over to Ukraine quickly. The Ukrainians have mobilized. They mobilized on day one. And they've mobilized quite well. They've weathered mobilization quite well. But the Ukrainian mobilization is a bit of a different fish, because people who are mobilized in Ukraine, it's hard to explain. If you believe that the Ukrainian army is running out of men, I'm sorry to tell you that isn't happening. The Ukrainian army is growing rapidly, and it is growing because, from the evidence that I've seen, is because there are more than enough Ukrainians, men and women, are willing to go forward to volunteer for service in the Ukrainian army. They are not being conscripted into the Ukrainian army. The men and women who are fighting in Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Kharkiv, they are not there by force. The vast majority of them, at least anyway. They are there because they feel the need to defend their country. They went forward to the recruitment office during the early days, and they signed up and said, I want to take up arms in defense of my country. That is the vast majority, if not most, of the Ukrainian army. And that's what remains to this day. And there are millions of Ukrainians in that boat. This idea that the Ukrainians are dragging men completely off the street, it is happening in various cases for specific examples. But the idea like there is a Ukrainian conscription gang goes through a neighborhood of Kiev and just lifts every young man that they see and say, you're in the army now, that isn't happening. There's various examples where individuals have been picked up like that, but it is not the case where it is a mass phenomenon. There are men and women who are being obligated to serve in a military capacity in Ukraine. Now, those people are people with specific war essential skills. These are mechanics. These are people, these are doctors. These are people with medical training. These might be some people who had served in the military and have various skills, but have since left the military. These are people who Ukraine has a shortage of in terms of the skills and capabilities that they have. So Ukraine has told them, you are now serving in the military because we need you. where a lot of these people will have volunteered, but some of them will not have volunteered, and that's what they'll have been done. Or essentially, for example, just using the mechanic example, this will be a person who runs their own mechanic shop. The war starts, the government, the military, the recruiting officer comes around and says, we need you to come fix our tanks. We'll pay you a wage or whatever, but either way, you need to come fix our tanks. Your business will still be here by the time you come back, but instead of you fixing civilian cars, we need you to come fix vehicles for the military. That's kind of where conscription mobilization comes into, where there might be an element of force in Ukraine. People might say, well, why are there young men leaving Ukraine and being arrested at the border? Again, you have to sort of understand is Ukraine is at war. Whenever its young men are fleeing, like these men aren't getting call-up papers and then they run to the border. There might be some of them, but the larger examples of where there's like Ukrainian border guards are arresting people on the borders of Moldova and Romania. It is illegal to leave Ukraine as a young man, because hypothetically, potentially down the road, the Ukrainians might need to conscript these men. So one, these men are showing cowardice by abandoning their country at its hour of need. So that in itself is kind of why these men are being lifted, but also it's at some point they might be obligated to give some kind of military service to Ukraine. This is why I'm kind of nuanced, just to sort of go off on a tangent on my own personal views. I'm pretty sketchy, elderly men with certain caveats. I can understand allowing them in as refugees. Women and children, of course, I'm perfectly okay with those Ukrainian refugees. But whenever Poland, Slovenia, Romania, the Hungarians don't really care. But whenever all these Western European countries decide, okay, we're just going to allow in any young Ukrainian men come here, probably not the best things that you should be doing if you're really meant to be the biggest allies of Ukraine, is allowing people who are meant to be potentially fighting for Ukraine to come and claim asylum in your country. Just a personal caveat, my biggest criticism of the so-called refugees from this lovely, fun, civilized area who come to Europe and commit all kinds of acts of diversity always seem to vast majority be young men. If these are people who should ideally be back fighting in whatever war they're meant to be fleeing from, if they are so abhorred by it. So that's just a little tangent there. So that's the issue of mobilization in Ukraine. Going back to Russia, let's have a look. Where was some of the examples of it? Now, the speed of this is something we'll have to keep an eye on, because the way I think this is going to pan out is, and this is kind of how I thought the Russians were trying to do it, is they were trying to fight this war kind of on the cheap. But essentially, the Russians don't seem to have had any offensive plans at all for this autumn. So they, from what I can appear to suss out, is that, how do I word this? With the forces it currently had in Ukraine as of 3 weeks ago, is the Russians were hoping that is what could hold the line until the Rapitsutsia and mud season, and whenever effectively all military operations cease in their entirety in Ukraine, because of the weather and the mud just drowns them down. So that the winter, potentially there could be some offensive operations around then. Then after the ground thaws out, going into January and February, you then come back into March and stuff. Potentially there could be, that's the spring rain season. It's the Rapitsutsia. The Russians, from my understanding, from what I could see, were hoping to hold the line throughout autumn, winter, and potentially into early spring next year with the troops it had in Ukraine at the moment. But in that time, the Russians were going to be generating these volunteer units I mentioned earlier to potentially bring up as a strategic reserve, or to fill up the battalion tactical groups, or to use as kind of as an offensive body for next year. That's kind of how I was looking for it, is that the Russians were playing for time to not mobilize, but to build up these volunteer units. Now, what I think is going to happen is kind of on the same scale, say the same time scale, with some caveats, but on a much larger degree. So there will be the Russians will probably, if they need to, fly in some of these rapidly mobilized, pardon me, some of these more quickly mobilizing units into the front where they're needed, say in Kherson, maybe up in Kharkiv. If there's a need for it, they'll rapidly deploy some of these units to Ukraine. If they're going to be smart, which is always you wear your life on your sleeve if you're thinking the Russians will engage in this in a smart manner, because what I'm going to be saying has already been contradicted by the Russians. But if the Russians are going to do this with any degree of foresight, is once they start to mobilize these 300,000 troops, they're not going to just send them straight to Ukraine. Is over the next over the next over 4 to 6 months, is as these troops mobilize, is you'll give them all like a year contract, something like that, maybe something else, but you will tell these mobilized troops you'll not go to Ukraine until maybe January or February. Is what you'll be doing throughout the autumn and throughout the winter is you're going into training. Is you're going to come back to your units. You're going to go out to your training fields. We're going to train you how to use the latest weapons. We're going to train you how to fight this war in Ukraine. This is how the Ukrainians are fighting it. We're going to try and prepare you for what you're going to be facing and how to deal with this when and as you get there. Spend the next 4 to 6 months intensively training these men. The problem with that is the Russians seem to have deployed a lot of their training base. They're the guys who should be training who ideally should be training these mobilized troops up. Your sort of senior NCOs, your people in your training regiments, the Russians seem to have deployed a lot of those to Ukraine, and numbers of them have been killed. So will they be pulled out of the line to go back and train? We'll have to wait and see how that happens. But that's if I was running this war, if I was the big man in Moscow in the Kremlin, if this was Mikhail Aronovich Bruksov, if I was the guy running this war, that is kind of what I would be doing, is intensively training these guys up, because the Ukrainians have significant numbers of men who have been training for potentially up to 6 months now, starting to enter the line, sending conscripts or just mobilized troops into them. They have equipment and artillery advantage, but they might not have exactly a skill and a manpower advantage. Also, the other thing is the Russians have lost significant amounts of equipment and material in Ukraine so far, especially in terms of what's happened over the past week in Kharkiv. What's the right term I'm looking for? The part of the Russian army that has borne the largest brunt of the fighting and has been degraded the most has kind of been that sort of top echelon part. The best equipped Russian troops, in terms of the equipment, the really modern and the best Russian equipment is been, in terms of its quantity, has been severely degraded. So to make up the shortfall, if you've got all these troops going back and training in Russia proper over the winter months, we will probably, and well, we've already been seeing it, but a lot of these older Russian tanks and vehicles that have been in deep storage, they'll probably start working on bringing those up to par and into operation. You're talking about stuff that potentially went out of service in the mid-90s. If you're being generous, stuff that might have went out of service in the 2000s. But this is stuff that is Soviet era, has been sitting in the field potentially for a couple decades now. They're going to take significant work to bring up to an operational condition, and this is not going to be the most modern equipment by any means. But you need to give your troops something, especially if they're going to be mobile troops. So we're probably going to see a lot more of the T-72As, the old T-80 models, we'll probably see a lot more of the T-62s coming out of storage. Essentially, the proportion of the Russian military that's probably going to go into next year fighting with the really good equipment, the T-72 B-Frees, the T-80 VMs, the T-90s of any description, let alone T-90Ms, they're probably going to become a very small proportion of the Russian military. One, because quite a lot of those vehicles have been lost. But two, the Russians are going to be bringing out a lot of older kit to make up the shortfall. So that's something else that's probably why I'm working on this 4 to 6 month time scale before we actually start to see the mobilized troops really start to make a difference. Is you put them into deep training, but also you bring out all the equipment in storage. You get it up to an operational condition, and if you can, you try and upgrade it where and as you can for these units to then go into potential offensive operations next March or April. The one caveat to that is it gets very cold in this part of the world during winter. The ground freezes over. The Russians could try for a winter offensive. They train up all these troops. Once the ground fully freezes out, that's whenever tanks can start to move again without getting stuck in the mud. We might see some kind of smaller operations or potentially a large operation during the winter whenever the conditions allow for it. So that's kind of the two scenarios we're looking at the moment. So one is the medium term. The Russians send these guys off for training for a couple months and bring out what they can from deep storage. Round about late November, December, the Russians might try and go into an offensive whenever the ground freezes out and tanks can start to move again. Longer term, late March, maybe into April, whenever everything's fully kitted out, the guys have had 6 months training. Mobilization by that time should fully have been carried out. They should have potentially easily the 300,000 men, potentially up to the million that is going around. And then that's whenever they open up a new offensive back then whenever everything starts to fall into place. Like I say, if there is a pressing need, they might speed some of these units to the front to stabilize a front if things start to get really bad over the next month before the rain season really starts to set in. If the Russians see that, the past two assumptions I've made, I'm assuming the Russians are competent, and that's always a gamble with the way the Russians have fought this war so far. If the Russians really want to do something very stupid and carry on doing the war the way they have been doing it, is these mobilized soldiers will be getting on planes and flying straight to Rostov and then going straight across the border within the space of like the next week, 2 weeks. I guess they could do that. It would make things difficult for Ukraine, but I think a lot of these guys would get killed and needlessly killed, and you'd be squandering stuff that Russia really can't squander. So I guess that's worst case scenario for me, as opposed to the other two scenarios we might see. So that's kind of the scenarios we could be seeing coming out of this over the next phase of the war. So to go into that, I will just... Now, how do I do this? I really don't like Restream. I need to figure out how to use OBS. Share screen. Window. So there's some interesting footage that started to emerge. This is reports of mobilized personnel starting to turn up at their bases, preparing for transport. Again, I would be assuming that these young men are being flown to training areas and not being flown straight to the front. But this is footage of people who have received their call-up cards and have started to arrive at the front. The other aspect to pull up into this is a lot of Western media are talking about a great exodus of Russian men. Indeed, there are Russians who are fleeing for the borders at the moment, which then leads me into another discussion we can have. Curiously, certain EU states seem to be becoming a bit of an asset to Russia at the moment. So the Baltics and I believe Poland have basically said that they are not going to allow any Russians fleeing conscription into their country at all. Kind of a bit strange to me. If you're looking to drain Russia, surely you'd want to try and pull as many young men out of Russia as possible. But that's what they're saying. So the story of the Baltics and potentially Poland and Finland is, sorry, young Russian draft dodger, you need to go and do your duty for the Rodina. The motherland calls. Go, you're not coming into our country. There has been reports that there are significant lines along the border of Georgia where young Russian men are trying to get across the border to avoid conscription in Georgia. That kind of has its own nuance specifically there. I think they're estimating, like, since the start of the war, like 100,000 Russian citizens have crossed the border into Georgia, and the Georgians are now saying they might start to put in visa controls to stop this because they're starting to wilt under the strain of this. But why am I talking about this? I think the people fleeing this aren't the people who are potentially at risk of being drafted at the moment, at least going by the law of what's being done. I think these are potential young teenagers, young men who have yet to do conscription, whose families are concerned for them or themselves are concerned for them, so they're running for the hills. The war, in terms of popularity in Russia, a lot of Russians say, yes, we support the special military operation. But up until now, in terms of people actually turning up at the recruiting office and saying, I support the special military operation, and I am here willing to fight in the special military operation, has been quite small. Russian recruitment has been pretty lackluster over the past 8 months. Russians might, on paper, support events in Ukraine, but so far they themselves have not come forward to stand up and essentially go to Ukraine themselves. Now that there's an obligation, it should be said that there are those who are avoiding the draft. We've seen the protesters, hilariously or not, depending on your point of view. Some of the people who have been arrested have been getting call-up cards and told, okay, you've now been arrested for protesting the war, you're now going to war. But it should be said that some anecdote, it's not verified, and it comes from Russian sources, which always has to sort of be taken with a grain of salt. But in some places in Russia, there have been reports that at recruiting statements, up to 10,000 young men have turned up. Either these are people who haven't, some of them have gotten their call-up cards, a lot of them haven't. So mobilization seems to have spurred potentially this idea, might as well go of my own accord before I get the card and see if I can get better conditions, get better pay, or else maybe they have now just been taken with, okay, patriotic fervor has hit. Now my country is in trouble. Now it's time to go and fight for Russia and go to the front. So that footage of those people lining up to go into the AN-12 potentially is that. So that's kind of how it's operating in Russia at the moment. Hundreds of thousands of call-up cards will have been posted or being posted as we speak. So over the next week and a half, 2 weeks is whenever we'll start to see just how this Russian ability to mobilize its troops, how quickly they can get men into training or into the field, how many people might start avoiding the draft. We'll start to get an idea over the next 2 weeks. Be interesting to see how the Russians deal with draft dodgers. Obviously, pardon me, if they get across the border, that's one thing. If a Russian draft dodger manages to get across into Georgia, he's effectively gone. If there's someone who's avoiding call-up and they're just going about their normal life in Moscow, like, is the local militia, the police, going to come and pick them up? Is it going to be the Russian military police? will they come pick them up? Then what happens? Do they get forced to go off to the front, or do they go into prison? I'd be particularly interested to know of any cases of Russians who try to cross the border into the Baltic states or Finland, get picked up by the border guards there or the authorities there and get deported back into Russia. What the Russians do with these people then, if they've avoided conscription, then these are things that I'm going to be keeping an eye out of. So, but like I say, a lot of these people who I think probably at the moment are avoiding the draft are not the people who are immediately subject to the draft, because the law that Moscow and Putin have fallen on, it very specifically is people who have gone through military services. All this is not the local commissariat going around scanning every room in the Khrushchevka looking for young men to effectively give the king's shilling, well, get the czar's shilling, and saying it's time to serve in the army. That's not what's happening, and I think it's kind of a fear has been set in parts of Russia. Obviously, there is a section of Russia that is very, very anti what's happening in Ukraine, and I think the sort of population, the young male population that is part of that, are probably over exaggerating things to a degree. That's not to say that they could never potentially end up being mobilized, but at this stage, well, you know, does the Russian government really care about the laws that it follows? There's always that argument, but going by the letter of the law that's been put up, I don't think the people who are currently booking out all these flights to Dubai and crossing the border into Georgia are necessarily the people who are the ones who are actually going to be subject to this draft. That was kind of my understanding at the moment, but we will have to wait and see, of course, as always, to see how this mobilizes. So just for an example, I will bring this up. This is from Radio Free Europe, which I don't like the source, but you know, footage is footage. Radio Free Europe being that glowy CIA outlet, but this is reported to be a border crossing in Georgia with Russians trying to cross the border and get out of the country. So somewhat similar scenes to what we seen back in February 24th, whenever a lot of certain section of the Russian population fled the country. And also whenever the initial Ukrainians fleeing the war in the early days, just big checkpoint queues at checkpoints. Why specifically so much focus on Georgia? Why not Azerbaijan? Why not Kazakhstan potentially? Bizarrely, for a country that has fought Russia within the last couple decades and has two de jure provinces of its country effectively part of Russia at this stage, Georgia has a very generous visa regime for Russian nationals. So this is why a lot of young Russians tend to go to Georgia. From my understanding, it's a year-long visa-free regime, and then once that year hypothetically elapses, is the renewal of that visa is pretty easy to do for Russians. So that's why Georgia seems to be the go-to stop for all young Russians looking to leave Russia as fast as they can. You know, people like our favorite Russian cocked YouTuber, NFKTZ or whatever his name is, and that Russian lesbian from the Far East, Natalia, they've gone to Georgia, and that's the reason for it. Kazakhstan, I don't believe, has as generous a visa allowance, and because of nominally, the government is nominally meant to be quite close to Russia. From my understanding, is Russians don't tend to look as Kazakhstan as a place to flee to, because they don't really trust the Kazakh government to potentially come and pick them up and return them back home. And the same sort of with Azerbaijan. plus also who really wants to go and have anything to do with the Azeris. But Georgia, like I say, seems to be the go-to position for young Russians. I was just showing the map, but the map didn't show. But I'm sure I don't need to go into geography for you guys. To give you an idea of just what these pages look like, again, I don't speak or read. I don't read Cyrillic, so forgive me. I can't. No, we don't want that. I can't read Cyrillic, so I can't translate this. But this is what a call-up card looks like. If you are a young Russian man, well, you don't have to be young, but if you've gone through military service or have a skill that is essential to the service of the Rodina, this is what you could be getting through your door sometime soon. So I can't read Cyrillic, but that I am willing to bet is the 21st of September 2022. So this is a recent thing. I think that number might be the recruitment office or the commissariat that this individual in Moscow. Let's see what I know that's more. I know that's Moscow. What else can I recognize in this? I can recognize a couple of words, but as I said, I don't read it. But yeah, so that is what the page will look like if you get it for your letterbox, if you are a young Slavnik. So what else is there to show before I get into the lovable and ever joyful topic of Strelkov? I guess because I actually haven't done it in a while, and we're all talking about events around the war, not exactly of the war since Kharkiv. Just to give you guys a quick update on what has actually happened on the ground over the past week. Not too much as such, at least compared to recent weeks. The Ukrainians were able to cross the Oskol River in parts, but from my understanding is they've been pushed back. So that massive penetration of the line doesn't seem to have materialized. The Ukrainians retook Bilohorivka in the south. Bit embarrassing again for the Russians. If anyone remembers back in June, that pretty catastrophically failed river crossing with pontoon bridges and all the destroyed Russian, but there was also some Ukrainian equipment, so the Ukrainians tried it as well. That disastrous river crossing that happened in this area, the Ukrainians have retaken that territory. So that's happened. The famous, I was about to say mosque, the famous monastery, Siverohorsk, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not. The Ukrainians retook that. And also the Ukrainians have begun attacking Russian positions towards Liman with an idea of taking the city. I don't even know if it's worth saying because it happens every single day of every week for the past 2 months. But the Russian and aligned forces continue to try and make probing attacks towards Bakhmut and Soldar, but they, again, don't really seem to make a lot of progress. And as always, Pisky is reported to have fallen or not fallen pretty much every day for the past 2 weeks. Where am I looking at? Where's the Divka? I should know this. Yeah. So, okay, this map is updated. Pisky is being controlled by the Russians, but continues to be very slow, grinding, fighting in this area. That's what's happening there. Some fighting on the Zaporozhye front has picked up. There is a build-up, reports of Ukrainian forces building up in areas. Specifically in this area, there was some discussion that they could have tried to have made another lightning offensive like they did in Kharkiv for Bilohorivka, with the idea of potentially eventually reaching Mariupol in the Sea of Azov. How viable that could be, if it ever could be, questionable. But so apparently there has been a buildup of Ukrainian forces in this sort of area here. But there's also been a pickup of fighting all along the front line, back and forth. As always, pretty much every day, someone don't know who, but someone seems to be continuing to drop shells on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The Ukrainians shelled how do you pronounce this? What's the name of this town down here? Vasilievka. From my understanding, is this was kind of like a agreed no man's land. This is where the prisoner exchanges happen. This is where the IEAE crosses the border. This was kind of like an agreed territory where there will be no fighting in this area, but there will be a military presence, but there will be like an agreement between both sides. Like this is a ceasefire zone for refugees, prisoner exchanges, and stuff like that. But the Ukrainians over the past week are reported to have shelled Russian positions in this area. So the situation here at the moment is a bit clouded. Pardon me. And then the kind of where most of the action has been since Kharkiv has slowed down is on the Kherson front. The Russians never really seem to have seriously contested or tried to nip off the inlet's bridgehead. I haven't seen any reports of it really making ground over the past couple of weeks, but this is where there's significant fighting. Fighting seems to have shifted down to the southern part of the front. What's this? Ukrainian aviation conducted 41 airstrikes. Okay. Okay. This is where, from my understanding, a lot of the fighting and action on Kherson seems to be happening at the moment. So back a couple of weeks, a week and a half ago, the Russian elements along the front line. So yeah, sort of along a line roughly along there. They actually withdrew. They withdrew as of their own accord to secondary defensive lines. So the town of Alexandriivka, which had been a strong point of the southern part of the front, the Russians abandoned that without a fight, along with Blahotnoy. Again, forgive my pronunciation, and certain other territories along this part of the front. The reasoning behind that, from what I could see, is the Russians have significant amounts of artillery units on the eastern bank of the Dnieper. That artillery only reaches so far. So from my understanding is the Russian forces withdrew to more defensible positions that now come with under that artillery cover. So that is what has happened on the Kherson front, from my understanding, over the past week and a half. And pardon me. And as always, the Antonovsky Bridge is getting shelled on a daily basis. The Novokharkovka Dam, part of it collapsed. So I don't think that is getting shelled more, because it's pretty much out of action, namely the bridge. The Russians are constantly setting up new pontoon bridges and ferries. They're constantly trying and being hit by Ukrainian artillery. So that's kind of the situation on the Kherson front. But so far, it appears that the Russian forces in this area are largely holding fairly decently, and they are inflicting quite significant casualties to the Ukrainians, from what I can see, especially in terms of equipment. Killing Ukrainians themselves is not what's going to win the war for the Russians, because the Ukrainians potentially could mobilize somewhere like 10 million Ukrainians for this. It's all about equipment. That's what the attritional game is here. And in terms of this area, the Russians seem to be doing quite a good job at attritioning down Ukrainian Western supplied equipment. The only problem is that what the Russians have destroyed in this area, the Ukrainians have captured far more in the Kharkiv area. So I believe it's somewhere like 60 tanks the Russians have destroyed here. Well, the problem is that the Russians gave the Ukrainians potentially somewhere up to 300 tanks in this area. So whatever attritional victories that might have been won here have just been completely evaporated, and then some by the complete collapse of this part of the front. So that's one thing to consider there. The other thing is there was some indication that the Ukrainians only had 15 tanks that they could put into the Kharkiv offensive. Needless to say, going into an offensive with 15 tanks and potentially coming out of it with 300 is probably a pretty good result. but that's kind of beside the point. So right now, let's see. Where is... Ooh, pardon me. Right. I am looking for something. Should also be said that, okay, just before I go into Mr. Happy Man himself, how is the West responding to this? We haven't seen too much yet. Everyone's at the UN at the moment, condemning each other. Zelensky gave a big speech saying that Russia needs to be punished, basically asking that all Russian seized assets should be turned over to Ukraine, stuff like that. I think the West is still digesting this, but I expect in the next week or so we will probably hear reports that Washington and NATO has now decided that they're going to significantly increase the supply of small arms and various weapon systems to Ukraine to deal with this mobilized force. We'll probably see an escalation of what is being supplied to Ukraine. I think now we will see that story about the Leopard tanks, the Leopard 1s, potentially some Leopard 2s, and some other old NATO's tanks, like potentially some old Patton tanks, I think from Norway. British Scimitar light tanks, I think we'll probably start to see those will now be on the cards. And Ukrainians will now start to head abroad to be trained up in their use. Those will not be seen in combat anytime soon. It could potentially be up to a year or longer before we start to see Leopards and stuff being deployed to Ukraine and operated by Ukrainians, but I think that is now something we'll start to see. The Americans as well have announced that they are floating the idea of sending F-16s to Ukraine, but that is going to be 2 to 3 years away. This is stuff that's gearing up for the long term. In the short term, a lot of the glowy accounts on Twitter are very much talking up the idea of sending ATACMS to Ukraine. That is a big line to cross. I guess the Russians have crossed a big line themselves, but an ATACMS is a strategic artillery missile. That is something that the Russians have repeatedly said if they were sent to Ukraine, that would be a red line that they will act on. The Russians have said that before about other stuff and never acted on it. But the problem with that is the ATACMS now puts into range all of Crimea, especially that bridge, that very important bridge here, which is specifically marked for various obvious reasons. This like the holy grail of Ukrainians at the moment to blow up and destroy is this bridge. I don't need to go into that for various reasons. As you can see, it's the only link between Crimea and Russia. That the ATACMS system would easily, I believe it has like a 300-kilometer range. The bridge would be well within range. Ukrainian missiles, Ukrainian ATACMS could be reaching deep into Russia proper, up into Kursk, Bryansk, Smolensk oblasts. Probably not as far as Moscow itself, but you're talking about like there's a reason why the Russians are pretty dead set that these kind of long-range weapons should not go to Ukraine, and why the Americans and NATO have been kind of hesitant to supply them. Because it's one thing giving HIMARS. The Ukrainians haven't really put HIMARS up on the northern borders and used them into Russia itself. They're kind of the mindset. NATO is kind of on the mindset this war should be contained to the territory of de jure Ukraine. That's where the fighting will and should be happen, and that is where the weapon systems that we will send will be tailored towards. If you start giving strategic weapons to Ukraine, that it kind of changes. Why do you need a 300-kilometer missile to hit Donetsk city, for example? Targets in Crimea, but there is sort of this idea that certain people have that once a weapon goes to Ukraine, it's only ever used if the Americans or NATO says it has, like this idea that HIMARS only ever gets fired once the Americans give its okay to it. That's not what happens. Once this stuff goes to Ukraine, the Ukrainians ultimately decide where and when it's fired as to their specifications. But obviously, a lot of the intelligence, they will have a direct link to NATO and American intelligence that are telling them that this would be a very good target for you to fire this thing at. But ultimately, the person pulling and pressing the trigger are the Ukrainians. So if you send ATACMS into Ukraine, the Ukrainians might say we're only going to use it in targets in Crimea and in the occupied territories, but ultimately it'll come down to if one Ukrainian commander who operates this battery is operating somewhere up here, then decides, okay, we're going to fire this thing at Bryansk. Okay, we're going to drive right up to the border and we're going to start firing these things at Tula. Tula, being a major arms industry center for the Russian military, would be a very tempting target, very high-profile target for the Ukrainians. It's those kind of things. Okay, we're going to start firing ATACMS at Milorovo Air Base in Rostov. They're the kind of things. And once American-made strategic weapons start falling on Russian sovereign territory, that's kind of when it's hard to see how the Russians would allow that to just go without some form of response. So that's kind of the potential problems with ATACMS, but then again, that's what all the glowies want to send to Ukraine, and the Russians have kind of made a big escalation themselves. There could be a strategic assessment in NATO, in the United States, that, okay, we're now going to escalate on our end, and that's one of the escalations we might do. So that is another aspect of what we have seen here. So what have I done? I've done scenarios, normalization, annexation, supply. Okay. I don't think we need this anymore. We need to bring up the happy man himself. Igor Gherkin, Strelkov. I'll give a quick spiel about him because I'm approaching 2 hours. I'm sure this is boring enough for some of you guys, and my throat's kind of dying. So I'll start to round this out on everyone's favorite memester, the chuckler himself, Igor Strelkov, and his response to what has happened. He's not happy, but he's not as angry as actually, no, he's probably more angry than he was. Strelkov is a man who's been calling for mobilization essentially from day one. He has been a staunch critic of the way the Russians have conducted this war. I often take a lot of stock into what he says because he obviously has a lot of contact within the Russian military with people on the ground. He has probably one of the best ideas of what is actually happening on areas of the front. And he essentially tells pro-Russian audiences things that they don't want to hear, which is what I try to do. But obviously what I try to do is basically I just translate what Strelkov says, and then people in my chat get angry at me for doing it. So Strelkov has been advocating for mobilization, for an escalation of the war essentially from day one. How did he greet the announcement of mobilization? Bit of a mixed bag. From what I've seen, he's been doing the rounds on Russian television. He was kind of this outcast figure, kind of like this crazy kook, like he's on our side, but he's a bit advocating extreme solutions, is kind of how most of pro-Russian Telegram but treated him up until Kharkiv. Once Kharkiv happened, that's whenever his reputation really shot through the roof, and now he has quite a big public profile in Russia. People use the events in Kharkiv as kind of like the vindication of what this guy has been saying for a long time. Mobilization is announced. What he said, from what I've been able to gather from what I can translate and from the press interviews he's been doing, is he's saying it's a step in the right direction, but it's nowhere near enough. So That's kind of his take on it. But then he got very angry and upset once the prisoner exchange happened. He's one of. I don't see the utility in Medvedchuk. I don't see why you would hand over 200 Azov battalion fighters for Medvedchuk. From my understanding, is he lost pretty much all his political capital and utilization pretty early in the war. And aside from his personal relationship with Putin, I'm a bit sketchy on if he's worth all those men. The senior Russian officers that they were able to get back, I can understand. The foreign fighters, a bit nuanced on that, but Strelkov got very upset over the prisoner exchange, and I can see why. You fight a war basically because you're saying the Azov battalion runs Ukraine and are Nazis who are genociding your people, but yet you're willing to hand them back into Turkish custody, but de facto back to Ukrainian custody in return for a pretty irrelevant oligarch at this stage. Round about 5 senior officers, which I think are probably worth their salt, but then around about 30 Russian enlisted soldiers. It doesn't, to me, that seems a bit of a strange. It doesn't seem to be, the values don't line up to me, especially the 10 foreign fighters that the Russians had. That's a bit of capital. Foreign nationals that the Russians hold, captured in combat, they're quite valuable. You could do stuff with them. You could leverage them in various ways. So Strelkov was quite angry about it. I'll bring up his post just to read what he said about it. So, pardon me. So this is verbatim what Strelkov said. At least this is what the translation came out of. Do you remember what I wrote when I found out that I should have a Strelkov voice, shouldn't I? So Strelkov says, do you remember what I wrote when I found out that Pan Kadowski was actively involved in the process of handing over the Azov in Mariupol? I wrote then that I'm not going to do the voice, where he is, there is always betrayal and nothing else. So he's attacking a political apparatchik. The release of the entire command staff of the Azov regiment is another evidence that this is also a betrayal in which he participated at the initial stage. Kadlovsky successfully completed. Although, of course, the main laurels should go to the unidentified persons from the top leadership of the Russian Federation, the merit of said former SBU officer, quote, former, and Akhmetov's security guard, undoubtedly. So that's pretty evenly failed. Strelkov is criticizing Putin directly here. Akhmetov is, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that's Kadyrov's father. That's the guy Putin essentially kind of did the deal over Chechnya with. Also former the merit of said former SBU officer. Okay, I read that as FSB. Okay, not too sure, but unidentified persons from the top of the leadership of the Russian Federation. Strelkov's always been quite a big critiquer of Putin, so I'm taking that as Putin and potentially other people at the top of in Moscow. He's launching up. So the release of 5 British mercenaries and the exchange of all the remaining members of the Azov regiment made yesterday by agreement with the Arab Emirates and respected Kiev partners is worse than a crime and worse than a mistake. This is an impassable stupidity or outright sabotage. It was apparently impossible to do this at least a couple of days before the presidential decree, before mobilization. Do you know what it looks like? And so they went out to the people, called them to stand up for Russian lands, and then choose who responded, were shot right on their head. So basically it's saying people who have now come to, who responded to their call-up papers, this is kind of a slap on their face. Openly mocking mockingly with chuckles and jokes. I'm really bad at reading. In no other way can I personally perceive such peacemaking on the day of the announcement of mobilization. I ask for the maximum repost of this message. So that's Strelkov's take. As you can tell, he's not a very happy man. He's basically considered this betrayal, stupidity, sabotage. Strelkov, without going, I might do a stream specifically on Strelkov because he's a guy with a very storied and interesting past. But he is a guy who's consistently critiquing everything, well, almost everything that the Russian government is doing. And I think a lot of it is with merit. And this is because why are you handing over the Azov regiment out of captivity whenever your war is specifically dedicated to destroying the Azov regiment? All the people who fought and died in Mariupol to capture the Azov regiment has kind of been, it's lost now. You've allowed foreign nationals, valuable foreign nationals now to leave. And in response, you've gotten a clapped out oligarch, a couple of decent senior officers, but then a bunch of enlisted personnel. And you traded 200 Ukrainians and foreign nationals for 54 Russians and one Ukrainian national. It's not really like, unless Medvedchuk still somehow has access to the billions of dollars he has in his foreign accounts. It's going to be, it doesn't really add up as to why. So the only assumption that I can personally put into it is the Russians are unironically use this as like a goodwill gesture, quote unquote. On one hand, we are going to escalate the war massively, but on the other hand, we are going to show to the Western powers, NATO, that yes, look, there is a dialogue, there is stuff that we can talk about behind the scenes. We're going to hand these guys over, your foreign nationals that we've captured, just to show, look, there are things we can discuss here. There is worth in dialogue while we massively escalate this war. Let's have this dialogue along the side as we progress with our mobilization. Let us continue these lines of contact just so that things don't potentially spiral out of control. So that's Strelkov's latest take. Let's have a look, see if he's posted anything else. Okay, what was 6 posts? Well, what have we got? Have we got anything interesting? Let's whip out the handy. Oh, pardon me. Let's hand out the handy Yandex Translate. He's just reposted the same thing. What is this? Do you remember what I wrote when I found out that why did he break up the big post and the 2 small posts? What have we got here? A live speech on Ivanov's schedule. Okay, he's doing a live stream. He's forwarded there. He's posted. Has he posted a picture of Teletubbies? What? Oh no, it's not Disney movie Monsters Inc. The government of the Russian Federation gesture. Okay, he's critiquing. I think Strelkov's probably going to get arrested soon. Especially since Kharkiv, like his criticism of the Russian government is lifted up to such a level that I think it's starting to veer on the edge of violating the recent wartime legislation. So I wouldn't be surprised if Strelkov finds himself getting arrested at some point. Okay, he's got fierce fighting continues near Liman. The Ukrainian armed forces continue to advance in the village of Dobroshovo. Where is that? Okay, he's given an update from the front. So we'll go have a little look-see there. And I will round this out. I'll see if anyone has actually been generous to gift me some super chats. Some donos, some good old donos. So I'll round this out and then I'll go have a look, see if anyone's given any super chats. And then I will round this out. So what have we got? We have, what does he say near the man? I think this is the town he's talking here, since that looks like the Ukrainian spelling. Fierce fighting continues near Liman. The Ukrainians continue to advance in the village of Devoroshovo and bypass it from the north, going to the rear of the defenders of the specified locality. Information from military commander Anna Dolegrova, who is not seen either in alarmism or disinformation. So what's that? Is that a female commander in that area? So if I'm let me just check. So this map isn't reflecting it, but this town appears to be still under Russian control. Ukrainians appear to be advancing somewhere along up the road, potentially cutting it off. No, sorry. Yeah, this town is under Russian control, as far as Strelkov says from his report that he's gotten from the front. But there are Ukrainian forces likely pushing up along this road with the potentiality of cutting off and isolating this position. But Anna, who seems to be the local military commander in this area, does not appear to be too alarmed by the prospect. So maybe they're looking at a potential counterattack, or the area is still very much in contention. So that's just the latest hot take that Strelkov's put out from his latest post. So yeah, I might do a proper dedicated stream on Strelkov at some point, because he's a very interesting guy, very interesting things to say. So, right. Been going for 2 hours. Let's have a quick look. See. Social no, that's does this mean we won't see another Spanish Civil War style volunteer battalions from Nicaragua and Mali being sent to Ukraine? I don't know. That could be something that could be happening. There was talks a lot of Serbians are getting flights to Russia, but there's at the moment I've not seen any reports of any foreign battalions starting to be formed by the Russians. Possibility of tactical nukes being deployed, unlikely, very unlikely. NFKRZ to be drafted to the front line. The problem is he's in Georgia, and I don't know if I don't think he ever did conscription, so I don't think he could be. I mean, unless he was arrested and then given a call-up card. But he's in Georgia, so I don't think they're going to get him there. Yeah, I'm going to have to figure out how to get the volume from stuff I play on the computer to go free onto the stream. You reckon Russian pace would get better with the 300,000 go to the front lines, seeing the FABs and being ferried to Milarovo? The T-62s they've been coming out of storage for quite a while now. And I did in a previous stream, I went over why. It's because they only went out of service fairly recently. So the T-62s only came out of Russian service like in 2012, I think it was. So they've not been sitting in storage for too long. They'll be in a far better condition to quickly bring back to operational condition and send to the front. But yeah. The 300K, I expect, will be more than enough to bring the battalion tactical groups back up to full strength, and also pad out some of the other Russian units. The question is whenever these guys come into offensive action, are the Russians still going to continue with this really foolish, draining, slow, glacial advance that they've been doing in the Donbass? Because it's not achieved too much, and if anything, it's completely vacated the strategic initiative from the Russians to the Ukrainians. It was just this: the entire Donbass offensive was just ill-conceived, poorly thought out. Why they did it, I don't know. I'd like to chalk it more Russian incompetence, but why throw your troops against this really heavily defended area. Whereas whenever you had Izium in Zaporozhye, there wasn't defenses in these areas, and you could have tried a war of mobility like you tried in the north of Ukraine and tried a grand encirclement. Like, again, if I was running this war, conscripts go off into Russia. Well, I train up the conscripts as well, but conscripts and mobilized reserves go off into Russia. Then March next year, I don't know, I would say I've always thought Zaporozhye would be a good place to launch an offensive out of for the Russians now that they've completely lost Kharkiv. I'd say take these troops, really start to put pressure on the Donbass, but in a unexpected way. Do an offensive towards Zaporozhye, not with an idea of taking the city, but with destroy the bridges across, like, just because the Russians are never going to take the city and take the bridges. Like, this is just conjecture on my part. This is me. I should probably do a stream where I like Hearts of Iron, all this, but this is what I think would be a decent avenue. Is you start to bring your troops down here, you bring up your reservists, you fill up the battalion tactical groups. This is provided you've trained them all up and you've equipped them all. You use your reservists or your by then bring the conscripts in to fill up the units all along the front. Then you free up the battalion tactical groups, you bring them down along the Zaporozhye front line, and then you take, what would this be, like a 40-kilometer, 50-kilometer long stretch of the frontier. Is you restart a war of movement and maneuver. And with the idea, the Russians, not with grand objectives in hand, but instead you push this advance up, say, along to around this here. So the outer ring of the offensive would come up around Helipol, push up along this creek here, up around here, not with the idea of taking Zaporozhye city, but bomb the bridges, take the bridges out of action in Zaporozhye, and invest the city from the east. And then, because this territory is considered like Russian land now, that you can use the conscripts. You bring the conscripts here to garrison this area. You keep some forces. Maybe you slowly make probing attacks and see where you can try and take the city, but you just essentially starve the city out, destroy the bridges, starve the city out, and just keep the city effectively under a state of siege. Bring up the conscripts and start to man this new defensive line, and then just use the battalion tactical groups as the way they're meant to be used. Then push out again over here towards Donetsk into the rear of the Ukrainian front lines. Well, then you've liberated pretty much all of Zaporozhye then, or liberated, whatever, reclaim Zaporozhye, however the Russians will word it, because that's the borders of the oblast. You'll then significantly cut off one of the main supply route Ukrainians into the Donbass. Options open up here. If you keep these troops, like, it'll be bloody, but they're probably no more bloody than the way the Russians are doing it, and they'll probably achieve more. You start to undermine the strategic defense of the Ukrainians in the Donbass. They're going to have to pull troops off and assets to meet this area. And then, well, like I say, Russians could then push into the rear of Donetsk and undermine the entire Ukrainian position in the south. Or maybe the Russians could then decide, okay, let's try and make a play up towards Dnipro. The terrain doesn't look like the most advantageous for it, but the options start to open up. Pavlovgrad, up towards Dnipro, into the rear of Donetsk. Things start to open up for the Russians here if they do this here. I don't think Kherson is going to be that area where they can do it, because with these bridges out, I don't see how you're going to support another 150,000 troops, get them across, and then open up offensive maneuvers in this area. The way the Russians are going to have to win this war for the foreseeable future is going to be on the eastern bank of the Dnieper, until, like, they start really building up bridges and negating the Ukrainian ability to destroy them. So Odessa and Nikolaev are out of the question for a long time coming. But like I say, this is me game planning it. Who knows? Maybe the Russians will really throw a curveball and try a new invasion from Russia proper in towards Kharkiv. I don't really think they're going to do anything up here anymore. So that's what I would do. That's kind of how I would be looking at it. Not feeding these guys into this, frankly, always fucking idiotic slogfest in the dust that really didn't achieve too much for what you lost in terms of man, equipment, and most time. Like if you're only advancing slowly, the Ukrainians are going to be able to counteract that offense because they can see what you're doing because you're doing it very slow, so they can plan around it. If you do something very quickly and if the Russians achieve this grand offensive that I've just sort of game planned in my head in the space of a week, well, that's going to throw the Ukrainians off. The Ukrainians will be hard pressed and rushed to try and counteract this. Especially if the Russians then decide, fuck it, we're just going to start popping the bridges across the Dnieper, which they probably should have been doing for a long time now. But hey, like I say, outside of the manpower issue, it seems to be the incompetence issue that seems to be holding back the Russians. But is there anyone still coping about holding themselves back after? Yeah. There is people who are still thinking like the Russians are only sending their worst to Ukraine at this stage. There's just no. And then there was people who were like, "Oh, it doesn't it really doesn't matter that Russia has abandoned like 150 to potentially 300 tanks in Kharkov, and the Ukrainians capturing a fully functional T-90. Oh, that's actually nothing at all because tanks are irrelevant." Kind of cope takes people have come out with, and it's just like just how do you reach these people? It's just bizarre. Was Putin saying he'd use nukes on Ukraine if they attack Russian territory, or do you think he meant he'd use nukes in there was Western intervention? Like, what utility would a nuclear strike be for the Russians at the moment? Like, the Ukrainian army is quite diffuse. It's not like they have 500 tanks all lined up in a small area. It's infantry spread out. Like, what would the Russians do with a nuclear weapon apart from like destroying a city? And why would they do that? Like, are they looking to be nuked themselves? The only place where any real tactical utility for a nuclear weapon would be maybe the Inholet's bridgehead hitting the pontoon crossings. But even then, I think that's probably just hilarious overkill. And the international ramifications of that are just far outweigh any utility in utilizing it. It's pardon me. Whenever they talk about nuclear weapons, it's with the idea of like to pressure the West to set a warning to the West. Michael question, but when are you going to treat all this more seriously? I've followed you from the beginning. You're always handled this topic with a mix of comedy and dismissive satisfaction. I mean, I think I did do it very seriously, like the first month and a half. I mean, I don't know how there's like, it's a pretty heavy topic. I know I don't try to take away from that, but I mean, it's like the first month and a half of this back in February, March, and part of April, whenever I did this, like it was pretty grim. Constantly looking at bodies and people being blown apart and putting in like the 15-hour days for like a month and a half, like, and it burned me out pretty quickly. Like, I'm sorry if it's not quite the thing for you, but like I don't know if it's just like I'm a news aggregator and I give my own little take, my own little autistic spiels and stuff, but like I'm sorry if it's not like as serious as you want to be. Like I kind of use the humor and stuff to kind of break the air a bit. I know some people in chat seem to like it. I'm sorry if you don't. It's just kind of like how I deal with things. Like, I'm not too sure what you're looking for me to do. Like, if you could give a frame of reference as to what you think I should be, but I mean, like, I just kind of use the, like, I just kind of use the humor to break the ice, and the dismissive dissatisfaction, I'm not too sure specifically what that's referring to. Like, if that's me, the way like I dismissively regard the Russians in some of the things they do, it's because it's because the way the Russians have conducted certain things has been pretty poor. And I just kind of, the way I would deal with it is just kind of mock it. So I apologize if it's not quite up to what you're looking for, but that's just kind of how I will deal with it. I do this day in, day out. I try and get a bit of entertainment and a bit of humor out of it from where I can, out of a pretty dark subject. So that's just it. South Texas Death for $20 US. Thank you so much. Thank you. We've got a big dono. Donos in chat. Thank you very much. Haven't seen you in a while. Been thinking about you. Thank you very much. Texas, if you're in the Telegram group, or you should join the Telegram group. I'm in there every day. And yeah, I'm hoping to try and get back into streaming, especially with these donos keep coming in. I joke. But yeah, I'm looking to get back into streaming. I need to justify people giving me money. It's the nights grow dark and the end it gets very cold. Something about, I heard Russia is drafting protesters. Yes, certain people who have been arrested have indeed been given draft cards. Quite somewhat funny. But I haven't seen it on too large of a scale. Bunker housing for 100 Swedish kronas. Thank you. Here's some Swedish, not yet totally devalued money. I mean, I don't know what's happened with the Swedish krona, but yeah, I mean, the pound hasn't exactly gone in a stellar direction. Now, do not give it all to Giza. Don't worry, I won't give it to Giza. She's been very sick as of late, from what I keep seeing. That's the reason I would have That's the reason I would give if I was a coward. So Mariupol is conquered. Yeah, you've been very out of tune, Texas. That happened months and months ago. Talking about topics that will get me in trouble with YouTube. Talking about another topic that will get me in and then combining both topics that will get me in real big trouble with YouTube. Forgive me, I'm going to skip over those. Have Russia declared war? No, not yet. Potentially the Russians won't be declaring war with what they've got now. They could certainly do stuff without a declaration of war. I'm happy with nuclear. Okay. Bunker housing again for another 50 Swedish krona. By the way, I believe your favorite Scott Ritter will be on Redacted tonight. I'm not familiar with Redacted, but I'm okay. I don't particularly want to watch anything from Scott Ritter. Good job. We got Liz Truss in command. Don't worry. Yeah, Liz Truss is during her speech. She was meant to announce it because of the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. Everything came to a stop in the UK, but now that the mourning period is over, Liz Truss, while she was in New York, announced that she has already committed the equal amount of what the United Kingdom gave in aid to Ukraine this year. They're going to give again over the next coming months and year. So, yeah. Don't worry, there will be an election soon and you can vote for the other. Okay. When is there is only one way. I bet you are Bob Stowe. Like, again, I'm sorry if telling you that the Russians haven't exactly done stellar in the war so far is something you don't want to hear and you get upset by, but it is what it is. Russia will the UK. That was my okay. Again, guys, I'm okay. Like, as long as it doesn't destroy the Telegram chat, I'm okay with you guys like spurging out in chat. But like, I could get in trouble on YouTube for this stuff, so I just prefer if you just keep a little bit of decorum there. And if you're going to do it, at least like, no, actually, that would get me in trouble. What I was just about to do. At least if you're going to try and make me say something that's like racist or anti-Semitic or something, at least give me some money for my trouble for it. Yes, good old Russia's best. Come on, say something bad about Russia. Territorial sound better. See what was your estimate. What or how will the troops be equipped, or in comparison with the active troops in Ukraine, what will their equipment be like? In terms of small arms, probably the same. I'm sure Russia has millions of AK pattern rifles. It's in terms of the tanks. I think the modernized Russian tank fleet has probably taken a inordinate hit. So it will be the vehicles that will probably be of second rate and come out of deep storage. Ratnik. I've only seen very few Russian troops wearing Ratnik, so I don't expect the mobilized forces to come out wearing Ratnik. Any recommendations on the Soviet conscription policy? Give me 1 second. Nope, that's not it. Okay, so I've got a. It's pretty out of date considering it was. What was the date this came out? It is a book called Inside the Soviet Army by Viktor Suvorov, published by the Book Club Associates London in 1982. So, yeah, obvious. This is a contemporary book, being 1982, and there is a section in this that goes into where is it? Yeah, there is entire part 4 of the book deals specifically with how the Soviets envisaged and game planned mobilization. So if you're into historical stuff, this is the book that does it. I'll take a picture of it and I'll put it up on the Telegram if you are still in chat and are interested in it. So again, the book is Viktor Suvorov, Inside the Soviet Army. Wait. Yeah, I'll just put it up in the Telegram now. So if you are interested, really interested, I doubt the book is still in print anymore, but I'm sure you could find it somewhere. We don't need that screen anymore. So that is the book there. If you are interested in Soviet, all things the Soviet army by the 80s, but like I say, it has a very good section on how the Soviets did mobilization. So where can I learn? Oh, yep. When Ukraine mobilized, it was very much a sudden event on the 24th. I'd be curious how many have left Russia in the past days. Ukrainian mobilization was already tailed up by them because don't forget the Russians had been threatening and building up for the invasion since like last summer. And especially in the months leading up to February 24th, there was various volunteer territorial defense battalions. I'm thinking of the footage specifically of the old babushkas in Lvov training with wooden AK-47s and stuff. So there was already an element of mobilization going on in Ukraine, but obviously once the war actually started, it just really hit into full gear. But then again, mobilization is something that's a lot easier to implement and carry out whenever you have a population who are fully committed to the process. Like if Russians universally reject mobilization and hundreds of thousands of young Russian men dodge their call-up papers, then obviously it's that mobilization experience is going to be a lot different, as opposed to Ukraine, where pretty much the vast overwhelming majority of Ukrainians have willingly, because they believe and are committed to the fight, and ultimately they're defending their homeland. They willingly partake in the mobilization, or in many cases mobilize themselves without government instigation. So they're still fighting on the cheap. They are getting as many names as possible above 300k lining up to go, trying to fill. Well, like I said earlier, it seems very vague, the wording of the decrees and stuff. So potentially they could, that's probably what they would go for, is an opening mobilization of 300,000 men. But then on top of that, they will continue a mobilizing men behind that when and as the situation requires it. Pardon me. If it's just 300k, how are draft dodgers even a problem? Yeah, I kind of outlined that. I think a lot of the draft dodgers are people who are not subject to this call up, at least going by the law, if the Russians follow the law as it is currently written. Why is that happening? Because 6 years of crime. Okay. What about Mongolia? Is this about people fleeing across the border? Well, I mean, unless you're like in Irkutsk, I don't think Mongolia is like the closest. It's very sparsely populated up here. So unless you're like in Irkutsk or somewhere like that, I don't really think Mongolia is like the go-to place. But ultimately, it comes down to visas. Like, is a country going to allow a Russian national to stay? I don't know the visa policy of Mongolia, but as I said earlier, Georgia has a very generous visa regime for Russians, so that's why they tend to go there. I think the whole draft dodger thing is just to get overhyped. Yeah, I think it is it's overplayed, obviously, but it does compound in a longer term problem, because all these young men, like there's 100,000 alone apparently have gone to Georgia. You know, you've had potentially somewhere like 60,000 Russian men have been killed in Ukraine. Russia has a pretty bad demographic problem. These are the people Russia's going to need. This is only making that problem worse, but that's an entire different conversation in of itself. Where do those 300 tanks captured figures come from? There's some guy who has been individually counting each and every instance of a captured Russian vehicle in Kharkov as of late. I think he mostly gets them from that Ukraine weapons tracker account. And he's come out with, I believe the figure was somewhere like 300. That's to say, some of them are in perfectly operable conditions. Some of them have been completely destroyed. Some are in between, knocked out. So that's where the 300 figure comes from. Probably, I should probably have clarified. 300 tanks lost. Most of them seem to be captured, not necessarily destroyed. Hi, Carolina. Long time no see. I hope you're keeping well. Aren't a load of them in Saudi Arabia? Okay, this is in regards to the foreign nationals. That's what I thought. That's what I read, but apparently not. They've already gone back to their countries of origin. So I don't know if there's a special allowance to the foreign nationals, or if someone's done the dirty and basically reneged on their part of the deal. But the Ukrainian Azov members, I know they have to stay in Turkey until the end of the war. I'm not too sure if that was the same applied to the guys sent to Saudi, because they have all gone back to their country of origin. I don't believe there was any similar requirements for the Russian POWs. Can Russians volunteer for the Russian Navy, or does that mobilization only allow for ground forces? I think it's only going to be ground forces. The Black Sea Fleet is pretty much inconclusive at this stage of the war. Maybe they'll mobilize some guys into the Russian naval infantry, but I imagine the vast majority of them will go to the army. Check your DM. Okay, I will when I can. If NATO decides to mobilize, how fast and what kind of force would they be able to muster given their energy shortages in coming winter? It's hard to say on the grand scale, but like if you're talking about NATO, like probably 30 million men. You've got 500 million here, 350 million here, like 60 million here. That 30 million men's probably a bit short, like tens, like dozens of millions of men NATO could probably like put into the field if it really comes to it. But the mobilization, I don't know. Especially once the Germans got rid of conscription, I expect they just allowed their mobilization system to completely decay and wither. The Finns are probably the best. Maybe the Swedes as well, because they maintain mass conscription in national service, so they could probably like easily kick out hundreds of thousands of troops, but they'd probably be more static troops than offensive troops. But I mean, like it's such a broad question, but I mean, like in terms of population capacity on its own, like you're probably talking like, I don't know, like tens of millions of men. Will DNR and LNR maintain their strict government rules when they become part of Russia, like a Slavic Church? That is something I want to talk about. That is something that I've been thinking about, and don't want to go off in a big tangent at the moment because I want to keep it for its own stream. But I think the Russians might have some problems with these territories when times come, because the Russian Federation does not really like autonomy. Putin does not like the Russian Federation isn't a federation. Governors are appointed oblasts answer to Moscow. There are very few federal subjects still elect their own provincial governments. Chechnya is a very unique case because of its history in Russia. These two republics have enjoyed a element of autonomy for quite a while. That I think there might be some chafing whenever it comes to their integration into Russia. I think there might be, I'm not going to say like these guys might end up fighting Russia. I'm not saying anything like that, but especially in the Donetsk Republic seems to be the most radical. Lugansk is the more moderate of the two, but the Donetsk, especially in 2014 onwards, was like a very radical place, very radical politics, very extreme ideas, very unorthodox individuals were running about in this place. One of them, Denis Pushilin himself, is one of these people. But the FSB is very strongly rumored to have been behind like the assassinations of people like Motorola, potentially Givi, because these people were like they were, one, because they had certain allegations against them in regards to war crimes, but two, because the conspiracy theory goes that Givi, Motorola, people like that, and elements within the Donetsk Republic, the original guy, I forget his name, the guy who originally led the Donetsk Republic, is that they were too independent, they were too radical, that they were pushing far beyond what the Russians wanted them to do. So they had the FSB knock off the radical elements within the DNR. So that's what the conspiracy goes. So I think, but even that aside, even if the conspiracy isn't true, is that Certainly Donetsk is a pretty radical place, some pretty independent tendencies here. Lugansk maybe not so much, but I think there might be a bit of chafing between Donetsk entering Russia in terms of some of the people who have power bases in Donetsk. Unless the Russians say to like Pushilin, okay, you are going to stay in your job, but you're just going to answer to us now, maybe. But whenever the Russians come around to saying, okay, it's time to move on, where you're integrated into Russia, you're now going to be run as a federal subject. That's where we might have some chafing around the integration process, but I want to say that for another. Will similar referenda take place in Ossetia and Abkhazia in time, in for a penny, in for a pound? I believe the Abkhaz have already said they will hold a referendum at some point. Ossetia, I believe, has maintained that they want to remain an independent state, but so this is Abkhazia, this is South Ossetia. So for those not aware, there is a federal subject of Russia called North Ossetia. South Ossetia, they're inhabited by an ethnic group called the Ossetians, the Ossets. South Ossetia de jure is part of Georgia. It was made part of Georgia by Stalin, but of course there was a war fought over this area. The South Ossetians have said that they are looking to hold a referendum for accession to Russia and then to form a unified Ossetian nation within Russia. But there is also an Ossetian volunteer unit currently fighting in Ukraine. The Abkhazians seem to be a fair bit more independently minded. I believe the head of their government back in May said that there will be no accession of Abkhazia to the Russian Federation. So, Christ, we're pushing a 3-hour stream. I need to push this up. Will Belarus join the war? And if they do, how will this affect Lukashenko? I don't think they will. The best thing the Belarusians can do is keep moving their army up and down the border to tie down Ukrainian troops on the potential that they might. But at this stage, and probably for the entirety, it's probably better for Lukashenko and for Belarus if it does not enter the conflict at all. If Belarus wanted to enter the war, it should have entered it on day one or within the first week. What lessons do you think China has taken from this war so far? That could be a stream in of itself. I could be here for an hour or two talking about that. To put it very briefly, don't half-ass a war. If you're going to start a war, you have to fully commit to it from day one. Don't think you can do it on the cheap. In terms of tactical applications, I apologize if it's a bit of a cop-out. I might do a stream on it, but there's just too much to go into. The topic is just so vast. Does partial mobilization mean sailors as well? I addressed that above. Michael, times for some cheesy chips. I know I would love a cheesy chip and gravy, to be honest. So it's 150 to 300 captured tanks. I can't find the evidence back up. I'll try and make a note to try and find the figure, but the number is constantly going up because there's constant figures coming out. But the original figure that I was working off a week ago was there was an estimation that there was around 300 infantry fighting vehicles, BMPs, BTRs, and tanks captured. This isn't including wheeled vehicles. Over the past week, that number has increased to where they're talking about like there's 150 to 300 tanks. If I can find the person who's keeping tabs or the source for that, I'll try and post it in the Telegram. If you're that autistic that you really want to verify this, just go into the Ukraine weapons tracker Telegram and just scroll up and just count individually every tank is from Kharkiv since like September 5th. There is a lot of them. Don't get burned out. I won't. My throat is dying down though. Yeah, you were at the start with Black Pigeon Speaks. It's a heavy thing to take on with a high psychological toll. Value your analysis. I can only look on so much on Telegram. It's pretty rough, but that's reality warm as hell. I enjoy your reporting style, even if it triggers me sometimes. Oh God, someone does. it's just the British deal with tough situations. Well, like I come from the ship posting wing of the internet. Like I, it's just how I do things. Boris congratulated Putin on his first speech after stepping down as PM. News to me. Western Vatnik do you watch any other YouTubers regarding the war? There's only one guy I make a habit to regularly watch. It's a guy called Perun. Has a bit of a Ukrainian bias, but he mostly deals with the bare economics and trends of the war, which I find quite enlightening. So I try to make a habit of watching Perun stuff. I did watch the Austrian military summary, but they stopped doing it for a while. But other than that, no, I intentionally make a concerted effort to not really watch anything to do with the war. The only time I've done it recently was I had to hate watch one of Scott Ritter's videos. But aside from that, yeah, I just make a habit to try and not watch stuff regarding the war. It's enough of a time sink just keeping up with the Telegram channels. I don't know. My brain would frazzle because unlike at the start of the war, whenever I put in like the 15-hour days, I've got other stuff going on in my life now, so I can't really be here day in day out watching it all. But also, my takes. Sound went off. Muted. Am I muted? Hello? It's showing up for me. No, it's not muted here. Fair enough. Oh, okay. You gave me a heart attack there. I felt like I was okay. Radio. Right. Where am I? Where was I? Completely lost what I was about to say. Oh yeah. So I intentionally try to make a habit of not watching other YouTubers because I'm going to. Perun is good because he gives like the strategic assessment of trends and economics of the war, so that's why I watch him. But in terms of like the physical on the ground stuff, like if I was to watch like Gonzalo or Scott Ritter or another person, like I would have a very like their impression of what the war is completely separate to what my impression of the war is. And my impression of the war is what I see physically being reported from the Telegram groups, both Russian and Ukrainian, and that's how I look at what corroborates, and then I make my assessments that way. That's kind of how I get my takes and stuff from it. Not to everyone's cup of tea, but it's just how I do it. I'm not here to regurgitate what I see or hear from another guy on YouTube. Your assessment about the war is right. Russia should have mobilized on day one. That the conscripts guard and police conquered. The problem is even if they did that, they couldn't have sent the conscripts in because it would have been illegal. If they did mobilize on day one, that the invasion still would have cocked up because the invasion was undermined through incompetence, but mostly because it didn't have enough men. What the Russians should have done is try to stealthily mobilize like maybe 2 months, 3 months before the actual invasion itself and slowly filtered those men into the units and then done it. But I guess if they did mobilize on day one, then round about June, July, then probably the Russians would have really started to pick up the steam because then those troops, if they were going through a decent training regime, would then have started to filter into the front line and probably really start to turn things around. Whereas the Russians, I very much get the impression that they've kind of been pushed. They're mobilizing because they've realized like this is it. Like we're losing and we're forced to do this. as as my throat is slowly being forced to die. Okay. I'll definitely check that book out. Seems right up. I'd love a tour of your library. I think I posted all my Russian books back at the start of the war. I guess I could take a picture of the bookcase if anyone's really interested in that. Sound went off. I'm not too sure what's happened there, if it went off for two people. Fair enough, I can't hear it. I apologize to people whose sound has gone off. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to have gone for everyone, but I might have lost to explain why that might have happened. I apologize. Most Russians understand that NATO wants to destroy Russia, and the Russian patriotism will only grow from here on out. Yeah, I have an idea for a stream going into that, because a lot of Western NGOs are now talking about the physical breakup of Russia, and I think that'll be more like a politics Spurg stream as opposed to like a war stream. But yeah, I'll save that for a rainy day. Okay. Is the Air Force doing their job anyway? They have done nothing significant. Yeah. The Russian Air Force is largely absent. I mean, it is doing strikes in Kherson and parts of the Donbass, but because of the Ukrainian anti-air defense, that sort of on-point tactical aviation is on both sides. It's pretty. See, I'm about to use a gamer word and say nerfed, but it's not the right word. It's diminished quite significantly because of the just the omnipresent anti-air defense on both sides. Both air forces are largely relegated to very, very tactical operations, or yeah, it's basically it, tactical operations. Both sides operate very sophisticated anti-air systems. They can easily shoot down most aircraft on both sides, and that's why you see the footage of both sides flying very low to the ground to try and keep out of sight of any air defense systems. So that was kind of one of the big failures of the Russians in the opening days of the invasion. Is they were unable to fully negate and destroy the Ukrainian air defense systems, and yeah, it's been an omnipresent issue ever since. I probably mumbled that a bit more. Why do you say we are probably going to die? I didn't really go into that, but because the way this is escalating could easily spiral out of control. Depending how the West responds in kind to Ukraine, in giving support to Ukraine to deal with this new mobilization, that has various very serious ramifications. Also, at this stage, it is very hard to quantify what a Ukrainian victory is. I can see a path to some form of Russian victory. I cannot, at this stage, this not saying it can't happen, but the Russians have now demonstrated like they're not half-assing this anymore. They're in it for a penny and a pound now. So the Russians weren't just going to stand by and allow their army to slowly be pushed out of the territories they held. With that in mind, it is hard for me to see how the Ukrainians retake these territories whenever you're going to have at least 300,000 more Russians pumped into them. Then that leads into that is long-term support from the West. What does the West do in response to prop up Ukraine in the long term? Then you come into talking about the Leopard 2s, the F-16s that some people are talking about sending to Ukraine. That will up the ante significantly. That is going to invest the Russians even more into it. And then once that starts to invest the Russians more into it, they become it's hard for me to see how we step back from this. Like, I can see a hypothetical Russian victory where the Russians eventually like take everything east of the Dnieper. Is that very likely? Not anytime soon. And the Ukrainian people do not seem to want to tap out. They seem to want to fight this to the end. So we're kind of stuck in this situation where potentially both sides are just going to keep escalating for the foreseeable future. And the war is going to expand and deepen. It's not going to wind down or become mitigated. This is why I think the prisoner transfer is kind of the Russians kind of saying, look, we're investing deeper into this war, but we want to hold open options here, have dialogue with NATO and potentially Ukraine as well as time goes on. What country has benefited the most from the war? China. 100% China. China pretty much wins either way. How has North Korea benefited? The North Korean thing is a bit of a nuanced thing, and we're not too sure exactly what is happening where and when. We'd have to wait and see what actually happens with North Korea there. But by far, in my mind, the Chinese have benefited by far the most of this. So, okay, I think that is it. So approaching 3 hours, so I'm going to round it out here. Thank you to the guys who sent those big donos. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. I'll see how much Swedish krona translate into British pounds. Thank you for everyone who's come along. I'll leave this stream up probably for the rest of the day. Then I'll take it down tomorrow and edit it out into a more cohesive video for people who want to watch it at a later date. As things pick up in Ukraine, I'd appreciate it if people would like to share the Bohanka Telegram group, see if we can try and reverse the decline in numbers, the terminal decline in numbers. Make me happy, make me feel like I've got new friends. The next couple of weeks will probably be quite big ones in Ukraine. I expect the Ukrainians are probably going to try and speed up any and all offensive operations that they can to try and frustrate the referenda that's going to happen over the next basically 5 to 6 days. So it's probably going to be a busy one. And I will see you guys then. And I think Felix was looking to try and stream at some point. So I know it's always hit or miss with whenever I say that, but I'll let you guys know, and I'll try and get back into regular streaming here. So with that,